Chapter 1286. After lunch, Li Tianlan didn't continue to be with Qin Weibai. The young Dong Huang, who had reached the top of the divine list, was rarely diligent. He planned to look through the materials that he hadn't read since military counselors sent them over. The materials were passed from different people one by one, gathered and sorted out by military counselor, and then placed on Li Tianlan's seemingly ordinary desk, which actually had an extraordinary origin. Li Tianlan's desk had many functions. For example, eating, watching movies, playing games. Sometimes, when Li Tianlan was in a good mood, it would even become a battlefield for him to conquer Qin Weibai. But the desk was never used for work. All kinds of materials would be thrown into an alloy safe when they arrived here and never see the light of day. When he wanted to take them out, he found that he even forgot the password of the safe. Qin Weibai told him the password. Then she watched Li Tianlan take out stack after stack of materials and read them carefully. All kinds of materials covered a wide range of fields. Countless industries under the Flourishing Age Fund were exposed and still hidden under this iceberg. Some were the resumes of some important figures of the new group, their ideas of Xianxia, some advantages and disadvantages, and future development directions after the analysis of the think tank of Emperor Dong's palace, and the various nodes of the constantly expanding intelligence organization of Emperor Dong's palace. The new group would officially appear in the vision of everyone in Zhongzhou State after the election. Xianxia, Dongshan, Nanyue, and Xia would all become the traditional sphere of influence of the new group. In the cabinet, Wu Jingmin and Bai Qingxian were also enough to raise a flag. In addition, there was the Ministry of Security that Xianxia now controlled. What kind of investment plan should the Flourishing Age Fund have in these provinces? How large the investment? Which groups or wealthy families should cooperate with? Who should be supported, this group or even other groups? And how to maximize the various resources in the new group to carry out the most reasonable expansion. In addition, there was the think tank's external expansion strategy after referring to the opinions of Zhongzhou State. The detailed situation of each city in Tianan, a lot of materials, in different aspects, explained one thing. That was, Emperor Dong's palace should completely integrate into the dark world as soon as possible. And the new group should completely integrate into Zhongzhou State as soon as possible. In the world of Xianxia, there was no clear friend or foe, let alone good or bad. Therefore, in most cases, there should not be clear likes and dislikes. Balance and stability were always the most important. The new group was like the sun in the sky, but such momentum could not be maintained forever. No group would welcome a team that was independent of them, because it meant that there was no balance, and if there was no balance, it meant instability. Therefore, the new group had to approach other groups from different fields and in line with their own interests. They cooperated in various aspects and fields, and supported some people with different standpoints but similar ideologies to rise to power. Most of the time, these things could become the foundation of one's standing, and they could also be used as weapons to attack the enemy. It was the same for all the major groups. Even when the Southeast Group and the Prince Group were almost at each other's throats, the cooperation between the two groups in some aspects had never stopped. Only by thoroughly integrating into each other could the new group truly stabilize its foundation. The relationship between Emperor Dong's palace and the dark world was, to some extent, the relationship between the new group and Zhongzhou State. Li Tianlan looked at it seriously. There were more and more documents on the table. The A4 papers were densely packed with words, all kinds of complicated and boring data, and there were no F***king illustrations. Li Tianlan naturally had a bad headache, but he didn't say much and just gnawed at the documents little by little. There was no doubt about the tenacity of a person who could insist on swinging his sword and sheathing it tens of thousands of times a day, regardless of rain or shine. He didn't read it before because he was lazy, but now that he had made up his mind to do something, Li Tianlan couldn't persuade himself to give up. Instead, he was more serious than anyone else. In his words, he was looking at his assets, and the happiness was second only to the time when he was lying on Qin Weibai. Qin Weibai stayed by Li Tianlan's side obediently, smiling. Occasionally, she lit a cigarette for Li Tianlan, helped him look through the documents, or stood behind him and massaged his shoulders and neck. She made a plate of small desserts and squeezed juice for Li Tianlan. It seemed that she was busier than Li Tianlan. It was nearly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Seeing that Li Tianlan was completely immersed in a lot of documents, Qin Weibai quietly left Li Tianlan's office. She went out of the corridor and got off the elevator. She left the castle. She walked quietly in her own home, like a scenery. A large number of staff and guards came and went in Emperor Dong's palace. Everyone would subconsciously slow down when they saw her. She and Li Tianlan were not married yet, but everyone called her Madam. She could see the awe and admiration in the eyes of those guards, and also the envy and a trace of jealousy in the eyes of those women who worked in Emperor Dong's palace. They wanted to be jealous but couldn't. Samsara Palace had become Emperor Dong's palace, just as Qin Weibai had said at the beginning. She had changed from the palace master's sister to the palace master's woman. Conspiracies, schemes, strategizing, these were things she was good at. But they were not what she liked. She liked this kind of life now. She liked today's morning and afternoon. She liked Li Tianlan holding her in his arms and watching the scenery. She liked accompanying him to do some small things when he was working. This feeling was peaceful and satisfying. It seemed that she would never get tired of it. She stood on the huge fountain square in front of the castle, watching the water column rise into the sky and the torrent. The wind that blew past her ears was mixed with the subtle sword qi, with the smell of flowers and grass. She walked and stopped until a very beautiful building appeared in front of her. The main body of the European-style single-family villa was white. It was located in the garden area of Emperor Dong's palace, surrounded by flowers of various colors. There was a small forest on the periphery. In front of the villa, there was a small arch bridge at the bottom of the lake. The water under the bridge was clear, and the fish were flowing toward the artificial lake of Emperor Dong's palace. This was almost in the center of Emperor Dong's palace, but it seemed to be completely isolated from the whole Emperor Dong's palace. The inside and outside of the forest were completely different. It was quiet, leisurely, and peaceful. Qin Weibai was a little confused. She didn't know why she came to this place inexplicably. She naturally knew about this place, but she had never been here before. In the whole Emperor Dong's palace, this was the only place that dared to hang Li Tianlan's name outside. Tianlan Clinic. At first, Xianyuan Wushang planned to name it Tianlan Clinic or Little Tianlan Clinic. Qin Weibai, who knew that Li Tianlan was not little at all, felt that Xianyuan Wushang was implying something about her, so she forcibly removed the word little from the name. A clinic that dared to openly mock Emperor Dong naturally attracted a lot of attention. So it was usually very lively. Of course, the so-called lively was only relative. Most of the people who could enter Emperor Dong's palace had entered the 4 realms of martial arts and were healthy. Even some of the middle and senior executives of the Flourishing Age Fund were successful people who paid attention to their health. It was completely rare for them to get sick. So it could only be said that the private hospital inside Emperor Dong's palace was more deserted, and there were basically no people in the clinic. After the establishment of the clinic, in Qin Weibai's memory, it seemed that she had never seen this fat man again. Oh no, she saw him once. It was when he reached out to Li Tianlan for money. The money was not much, less than 10 million yuan. Then this damn fatty bought almost a warehouse full of coke, which almost filled up most of the wards in his clinic. The rest of the money was random drugs that he probably didn't even know what they were used for. Then he used the remaining millions of yuan to play the game. His whole body was covered in godly equipment. He led a befuddled life. He really led a befuddled life. After that, Qin Weibai didn't even hear that Xianyuan Wushang went out. Qin Weibai hesitated for a moment and stepped forward. She walked across the bridge and passed by the garden. After all, it was a clinic. The door was closed, so Qin Weibai went straight in. The inside of the clinic was surprisingly clean and tidy, unlike the usual den of a fat otaku. Xianyuan Wushang was sitting in front of the computer with his back to Qin Weibai, cursing, "That's the assassin. He's killed me twice. Focus fire and kill him in one wave. Knight, be invincible. Aha, watch me fight 7 to 7. Where's the priest? Add. Open the boss, open the boss." Damn it, what's there to be afraid of? Open it, open it, open it. He stared at the screen, casually picked up a large bottle of Coke from beside him, and raised his head. Qin Weibai saw with her own eyes that the large bottle of Coke was reduced by more than half in an instant. He fumbled on the table with his other hand for a long time, but to no avail. He roared, "Xingtan, get 2 cartons of cigarettes. Quick, fire support." Qin Weibai watched silently for a while and suddenly understood why she came here. Some questions that had been completely suppressed in her mind resurfaced when her heart was the most relaxed. She subconsciously came here, thinking that Xianyuan Wushang could give her an answer. Qin Weibai coughed softly. Xianyuan Wushang, who was busy commanding the instance dungeon again, didn't notice it for a moment. Qin Weibai said helplessly, "When the patient dies behind you, won't you notice that the body is cold?" Xianyuan Wushang's chubby body suddenly shook, and he turned around in astonishment. Then he stood up instinctively. A sister-in-law is here. Sit. He casually turned off the computer, picked up a new bottle of Coke with a hollow smile, and poured a cup for Qin Weibai. Qin Weibai was silent for 2 seconds. "Don't you even have water here?" Xianyuan Wushang said righteously, "I don't like to drink it." This was a clinic that provided Coke to patients for free. No matter what was wrong with you, have a large cup of Coke to calm down first? Qin Weibai didn't touch the Coke in front of her. This kind of carbonated drink had a great impact on the body and skin, and it was completely her natural enemy. She had never touched it in her previous life or this life. "I heard from Tianlan that Xing Tian recently asked for a leave and specially asked for a quiet room. Is he playing games with you?" Qin Weibai asked. She hadn't seen Xianyuan Wushang during this time, but she had seen Xing Tian several times. Xing Tian was one of the guards of Emperor Dong's palace now. His figure was too conspicuous, and sometimes he could be recognized at a glance even if he was far away. He's not playing games. He's busy recently," Xianyuan Wushang said with a smile, "but he can hear me calling him here. He should be going to get me a cigarette now." Xianyuan Wushang lived a leisurely life. But Xing Tian had been carrying out the task given to him by Xianyuan Wushang. He was looking for Wang Yuetong. With limited clues and the possibility of being deceived, the first thing Xing Tian wanted to find was the eldest princess in the time corridor. As long as the eldest princess felt the trace of Xing Tian searching for her, her will would come to Tiannan immediately. At that time, he could directly ask the eldest princess where Wang Yuetong was. However, this was obviously a rather difficult task. Fortunately, the eldest princess was an ally. If she was a top figure in a hostile state, it would be completely impossible for Xing Tian to find her. It was even possible that he would be cheated of his life unknowingly. Qin Weibai took a deep look at him and didn't say much. Seeing that Qin Weibai had no intention of drinking water, Xianyuan Wushang took the Coke in front of her and took a sip. He asked curiously, "Sister-in-law, are you not feeling well?" As he spoke, his eyes involuntarily glanced at the computer that had just been turned off. It seemed that he was still thinking about the instance dungeon that he had just started. Qin Weibai pretended not to see Xianyuan Wushang's absent-mindedness and said blandly, "I just saw a man in the biological laboratory." Xianyuan Wushang looked confused. "I forgot what he looked like." Qin Weibai frowned. But he seemed to be seriously injured. It was the kind of injury that seemed to be getting injured every minute and second. "I saw with my own eyes that his wounds were torn and healed." Her thoughts began to become clear, and she was completely sure that Xianyuan Wushang must have some clues. She thought of the movie she had seen. The space-time she saw. Why did she come to find Xianyuan Wushang? It was not because of the various strange states that Xianyuan Wushang showed when he saved Li Tianlan. The main reason was that she saw Xianyuan Wushang suddenly appear on the surface of Beihai in the fast-forward scene of another spacetime. He stood with Li Dongqing and seemed to say something. Xianyuan Wushang at that time was exactly the same as he was now. What did this mean? Looking at the movie from the perspective of this spacetime, it was difficult to tell whether what happened in the movie was in the past or in the past. But the key age should not be wrong. When Qin Weibai saw Xianyuan Wushang in the movie, Li Dongqing was already 40 years old. But Xianyuan Wushang was still a young man. If that Xianyuan Wushang belonged to that spacetime, he should be at least 70 years old based on his current age. But the Xianyuan Wushang she saw was still the same as now. He suddenly appeared and disappeared. Did this prove that the Xianyuan Wushang in the movie she had seen was the fat man in front of her? Could he go directly from this spacetime to that spacetime? It sounded incredible. But this seemed to be the only explanation. If Xianyuan Wushang could do it, then what was his relationship with the man who had invited her and Li Guangtu to watch a movie? That was why she came to this clinic. Here, she might be able to find some crucial clues or even directly find the answer. Xianyuan Wushang's pupils suddenly contracted. All his absent-mindedness seemed to vanish in that instant. You're injured every second? Xianyuan Wushang looked at Qin Weibai seriously. It's not just injuries. Qin Weibai shook her head. And it's still healing. I saw it with my own eyes. His skin seemed to be torn by something, but before I could see it clearly, the wound on his body had already healed. Xianyuan Wushang was silent for a long time before he lowered his voice and slowly said, "Where was he injured?" "My entire body." Qin Weibai frowned and said, "That should be the case. What I saw was that there was a mist of blood all over his body, but all the wounds were healing. Then they were torn again and healed again." Xianyuan Wushang said nothing. He took his place. His face was calm. "Biological laboratory," he whispered to himself and suddenly asked, "Where is he?" "I don't know." Qin Weibai calmly said, "He invited me and Li Guangtu to watch a movie and then disappeared." "A movie?" Xianyuan Wushang was a little hesitant. Qin Weibai's voice became calmer and calmer. "It's a movie about my son and Tianlan's." In this space-time, Qin Weibai was not pregnant. But she talked about her son. Xianyuan Wushang's heart suddenly shook, and there seemed to be a flash of light in his mind. Vaguely, he seemed to see the context of something. He hesitated for a moment and slowly said, "Sister-in-law, did you see Dongqing?" Qin Weibai's eyes suddenly lit up. She stared at Xianyuan Wushang and said, "In the movie, the person who appeared on the surface of Beihai was indeed you." On the surface of Beihai, Xianyuan Wushang thought for a moment. It should be the time when he accidentally borrowed the space-time of the master of Samsara Palace to go to the War God realm and met Xianyuan Luanhui. Xianyuan Wushang nodded and said, "It was me, but I stayed there for a short time. Dongqing's condition seems to be very bad." "Can you still be in the past?" Qin Weibai was a little excited. If Xianyuan Wushang could go there, Qin Weibai would very much like to be with Li Tianlan. What would it be like to have a father-son exchange between the two generations of heavenly sons? "Sister-in-law, you think too highly of me." Xianyuan Wushang smiled bitterly. "That time was completely an accident. I could go there because the other you inadvertently helped me. Otherwise, I could only use the stupid method, and this stupid method can only be used by me. Neither you nor my brother can use it. The so-called stupid method. It was to leave Miracle City with his consciousness, reach the edge of the crisscrossing space-time through the node of the quantum network, and enter the area of the War God realm and the Emperor Palace from there. Such a method, such a long distance, Qin Weibai and Li Tianlan did not even think about it. That person should be able to do it, right? Qin Weibai's eyes were in a trance. Xianyuan Wushang curled his lips. "Of course he can do it, but he can't do it. However, it's impossible for me to do so. I'm afraid I have no choice but to invite you over." "What do you mean?" Qin Weibai's eyes slightly narrowed. Xianyuan Wushang did not explain. In fact, he had already explained. Li Dongqing was in a bad state. In fact, neither the human emperor of the Emperor Palace nor the war god of the War God realm valued the current Wang family of Beihai too much. He met Li Dongqing that time, just when Li Dongqing destroyed Beihai, and he also met Xianyuan Luanhui, the first disciple of the war god, who was now known as the first celestial expert in the starry sky. Xianyuan Luanhui did not stop Li Dongqing for the Wang family of Beihai. It was for Li Dongqing himself. Hatred had become Li Dongqing's obsession, and it could even be said that it was all his motivation to live. If the Wang family of Beihai completely disappeared in that space-time, then there would really be nothing left in the life of the sword god. Self-destruction was the only way for him. Xianyuan Wushang did not know what the end of the Wang family of Beihai in that spacetime was. But the war god realm sent someone to invite Qin Weibai over. Obviously, Li Dongqing should have lost his obsession and was in a bad state. They wanted to give Li Dongqing a new way and rekindle his life. If Qin Weibai had completed the task, then before the Li family returned to the peak, they would not have many opportunities to meet. How much did the war god and the human emperor value the sword god? The first disciple of the war god personally appeared to escort him. In the Supreme Hall, the war god personally met the great emperor Xianyuan and even wanted to betroth the palace master to Li Dongqing. The sixth princess of the war god realm could be said to be as famous as Lin Shi. In some aspects, she was even more superior than Lin Shi. She married Li Dongqing. At this stage, it was a real marriage. Even if Li Dongqing really reached the peak, the sixth princess could not be regarded as a social climber. The war god realm did all this just to keep the sword god in the war god realm. They wanted to rob the sword god from the space-time corridor. How could they let Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai go to see him again? At least they had to wait until the sword god and the sixth princess made love, or even bore fruit. At this stage, for the space-time corridor, leaving the sword god in the war god realm was also the best choice, because most of the resources of the space-time corridor would be tilted to Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai. Staying there, the sword god could grow better. If there is a chance, we will meet again. Xianyuan Wushang looked at Qin Weibai and comforted her. Qin Weibai was silent for a while and said lightly, "I just want to know who invited me to the movie." I didn't see him." Xianyuan Wushang smiled bitterly and said, "How would I know if I didn't see him?" He picked up the Coke and took a sip. That person was wearing a black dragon robe. Puff! Cough, 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 cough. Xianyuan Wushang spat out the Coke and coughed violently. "Are you sure?" He looked at Qin Weibai and asked. "It should be the dragon robe. That dress is more fancy than Wu Qing's. The pattern keeps changing." Qin Weibai pondered. "World Punisher?" "No, all worlds," Xianyuan Wushang said softly. "What?" Qin Weibai asked. "Nothing." Xianyuan Wushang responded subconsciously. Qin Weibai narrowed her eyes and said coldly, "Who was it? Tell me." Xianyuan Wushang moved his lips and couldn't help but smile bitterly. He thought the person who invited Qin Weibai to the movie was just a core member of the Imperial Palace or the War God realm. He didn't expect it to be that black dragon robe. It was so easy to recognize. There were only two people who could wear dragon robes in that space and time. Obviously, the human emperor in white was not one of them. Then the remaining one, he did know who it was, but he didn't dare to say it. It wasn't because of any malice in the world. He just didn't dare to say it. "I really don't know," Xianyuan Wushang said helplessly, "but you can rest assured that the other party has no malice. I can guarantee that." It was not malice. The kindness within was practically overflowing from it. "I really have no malice." A voice suddenly rang out. A beam of light suddenly lit up in front of Xianyuan Wushang and Qin Weibai. The light was not dazzling, but the moment it appeared, the surrounding space suddenly blurred. In their sight, the figure of the young man with blood mist floating all over his body appeared in front of the two again. The black dragon robe was full of sharp light. Qin Weibai narrowed her eyes. But Xianyuan Wushang stood up almost instinctively. He moved the corner of his mouth and finally lowered his head, saying in a hoarse voice, "Your Majesty." It was really him. To think that he would actually come. Xianyuan Wushang's eyes were a little dazed. The three supreme masters of the human clan. The one in front of him ranked last, but he was the craziest one. He was also the one that people most feared and yearned for. The unfathomable human emperor. The great Emperor Xianyuan overlooking the starry sky. And the one in front of him was synonymous with showing off his abilities. His fighting capacity was not the strongest among the three supreme masters. But since ancient times, in terms of martial arts alone, his existence was the peak that no one could surpass. He represented the strongest sword light of the human clan. In this respect, Even great Emperor Xianyuan and human emperor were not as good as him. A madman who was determined to surpass Her Majesty Huang Shi in martial arts, and even had vaguely surpassed the original Huang Shi. The god of war's realm. The god of war. The blood mist floated in the air. The young man in the black dragon robe glanced at Xianyuan Wushang and then nodded slightly to Qin Weibai. Your Highness, please introduce yourself. His voice was calm and gentle. My name is Lin Xianyuan. Wow, so far, the number of words I have written this month has exceeded last month. Chapter 1287. My name is Lin Xianyuan. The voice of the god of war was concise and peaceful. But this self-introduction was countless times more effective than any extravagant flattery. Strong wind, heavy rain, thunder, and tsunami. Qin Weibai's entire worldview seemed to be shattered in front of these three words. Who was Lin Xianyuan? Zhongzhou State had a population of more than 1 billion. Billions of people in the world. But anyone who went to school and studied history would not be unfamiliar with this name. He was recorded in the history of Zhongzhou State and the history of all countries in the world. Mentioning this name was like mentioning Genghis Khan, Alexander, and Caesar. Speaking of Napoleon, countless years had passed. As long as civilization existed, these names would always shine in their own times. Lin Xianyuan. Lin Xianyuan. The first generation of the god of war in Zhongzhou State. The founder of Zhuanyuantai in Zhongzhou State. The ancestor of the Lin clan. The only god of war in the history of the Wang family of Beihai. He and the ancestor of the Wang family of Beihai rose decades apart. After the ancestor of Beihai died, he spread his wings and covered the entire Zhongzhou State and Beihai. He did not retreat, but moved forward. In his era, Zhongzhou State completely had the strength and confidence of the world's first power. It was a time when the whole world was silent and only Zhongzhou State was shining. Different from the ancestor of Beihai who founded the Wang family of Beihai and left the southeast group. The first god of war, who guarded Zhongzhou State but never took root in Zhongzhou State, was evaluated even more than the ancestor of Beihai in history. He lived for less than 100 years, but what he did was the real demeanor of the god of war. Qin Weibai couldn't imagine how peerless the god of war had been at his peak. She could only admire his sharpness through the few words in history. But time flew. Hundreds of years had passed. Zhongzhou State had passed 10 generations of gods of war, including Gu Xingyun. When the new god was about to take the throne, someone came to her and told her his name was Lin Xianyuan. It was a feeling of a person in a history book walking into reality. Qin Weibai, who thought she would not be surprised by anything, had a confused look in her eyes. Astonishment, confusion, doubt, and all kinds of emotions intertwined in her eyes, turning into a strong sense of absurdity and ridicule. In the voice that almost shattered the world, Qin Weibai heard her own voice. Your name is Lin Xianyuan? In the floating blood mist, the god of war nodded. Qin Weibai fell silent. She was silent for a long, long time. Everything she had seen about Xianyuan Wushang appeared in her mind. His mutterings were inexplicable. He could act mysteriously as he pleased. He did not engage in proper work, eating and waiting for death. But no matter what, this fat man who called him sister-in-law did save Tianlan's life and made a great contribution to Tianlan's martial arts breakthrough. Finally, Qin Weibai nodded and whispered, So, transfer money? Lin Xianyuan, I, Emperor Qin, send money. How similar was this scene to a joke? However, in Qin Weibai's eyes, they were obviously playing at a higher level. That unforgettable movie. It was a mysterious entrance. Patiently and meticulously laid out the foundation. He even looked for to. Qin Weibai thought it was a good job and deserved a reward. Sister-in-law, this is really His Majesty the God of War. The corners of Xianyuan Wushang's mouth kept twitching as he tried his best to hold back his laughter. He looked like he was in pain, but he didn't know that he had become a burden in Qin Weibai's heart. Qin Weibai nodded and said briefly, how much do you want? Xianyuan Wushang, the god of war, suddenly laughed. Looking at Qin Weibai's eyes, he said slowly, It's not that you don't believe us. You just don't believe us. You can't find a reason to believe us, so you try to convince yourself that we are liars. But can you really convince yourself? Qin Weibai frowned. I am the Lin Xinyuan you know, but I can't show you any direct evidence. Countless blood mists burst out from his body. The voice of the god of war was still calm. The Lin clan has my portrait. You should feel that I look familiar. Qin Weibai's heart suddenly shook. The existence of Dongqing is a secret that only you and the other you know. Even Jiang Shangyu doesn't know his name, and you have just seen his life. Time travel and life restart also sound incredible. You don't believe in my existence, which is equivalent to determining the meaning of your own existence. Qin Weibai sneered. Existence is existence. This in itself is meaningful. My being here is meaningful. The god of war nodded in agreement. My being here is also meaningful. Qin Weibai's eyes flashed. The war god's voice continued, You are the initiate, and you have already become a dream puppet. Toying with the consciousness, destroying the mind, and even enslaving the soul is the specialty of your branch. I represent that space-time. If you don't believe me, it is the same as doubting the rationality of your own existence. If a dream realm puppet even doubts the rationality of its own existence, then you're already very close to collapsing. More and more blood mists floated out of the god of war's body, and the faint blood color had almost covered his body. The black dragon robe on his body was shining, and countless patterns were constantly changing. Kill the world. All worlds. This was the divine artifact of the god of war's realm, and also the weapon of the god of war. The different names were because of its two forms. The all worlds in the dragon robe form could be said to be one of the strongest defensive divine artifacts in the starry sky, and the kill the world in the sword form was an invincible divine blade. Its level was not as high as the king guard, but there was only one king guard, and under certain circumstances, the kill the world did not have certain restrictions. The god of war was a person who did not like too many restrictions. Qin Weibai's heart gradually calmed down. After seeing the god of war, their conversation instantly turned into a spiritual storm in her mind, constantly replaying. She glanced at the god of war and said slowly, What are the initiators and dream puppets? The god of war raised his eyebrows, but before he could speak, Xianyuan Wushang had already said in a low voice, Your Majesty, be careful with your words. The god of war was silent for a moment, and laughed somewhat self-deprecatingly. I can't give you an answer for now. When there is a chance, I will tell you. Both Qin Weibai and Xianyuan Wushang noticed that the god of war had changed the way he addressed himself. This seemed to be a change in mentality. Xianyuan Wushang breathed a sigh of relief. The miracle city was still calm and tranquil, not attracting the attention of the starry sky. But Xianyuan Wushang was very clear that the starry sky outside the miracle city had long been filled with the flames of war. This was already the beginning of the battle of eradication. He didn't understand what was going on with the god of war in front of him, but he was very sure that the god of war's true body was already on the battlefield. The opponent he faced would naturally not be cannon fodder of the Order camp, but could only be a peak existence similar to the Doomsday. In terms of martial arts authority, the god of war had already reached the true peak. Under normal circumstances, he could indeed say many things that Xianyuan Wushang dared not say, and he also didn't have to be too afraid of the will of the world and the malice of the world. But now the god of war was on the battlefield, and the human race was fighting against the world. For the god of war, the starry sky rules, which had been created by the malice of the world, were already very difficult to deal with him. But the god of war currently had an opponent. If the god of war wanted to ignore it, it was very likely that the moment he said a word, his opponent would suddenly have a fighting strength far beyond his own, and in an instant, the god of war would be seriously injured. If the god of war was sick, it would have a great impact on the entire battlefield. Moreover, taking 10,000 steps back, Xianyuan Wushang himself was the guide of Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai. Under what circumstances, it was Xianyuan Wushang's responsibility and obligation to let them come into contact with the real and cruel starry sky bit by bit. This power was given to him by the space-time corridor, which meant that he represented the will of the space-time corridor. Now was not the time for Qin Weibai to come into contact with these things, so she couldn't. Letting Qin Weibai know that the god of war in front of her was called Lin Shenyuan was actually a violation of the rules. But the god of war had directly descended and said it. What could he do? Shenyuan Wuxiang felt a little helpless. He took a deep breath and looked at Qin Weibai, who was still in a state of confusion. He frowned and said softly, "Sister-in-law, you don't have to care about whether what His Majesty said is true or not. After all, he doesn't have any malice. And now, some things that you have come into contact with will only bring you danger, and these are all temporarily unnecessary information, so you don't have to look into it. In fact, even if His Majesty exists, you don't have to look into it. He is not the true body, and with his current strength, he is not even a match for Big Brother here." "I don't have the strength." The god of war smiled. His palms seemed to want to touch the table and chair in front of him, but his arm directly passed through the table and chair like a shadow. "I also don't have any ability to interfere with reality. I'm illusory. Other than being able to speak, I basically can't do anything. As for combat power, I don't have any at all." "Where is your true body?" Qin Weibai suddenly asked. If the so-called Lin Shenyuan in front of her couldn't do anything, then the movie just now obviously had something to do with his true body. The god of war took a deep look at her and said softly, "Very, very far, measured in light years." The blood mist in his body burst out at a speed visible to the naked eye. The god of war's voice was very calm. "The world is very big and you should all see it. Although, that's not what you want to see." Qin Weibai's pupils suddenly contracted to the extreme. Very, very far. Measured in light years. This sentence, it contained too many things. Once again, Qin Weibai thought of the only dream she had now. In the dream, there seemed to be an endless starry sky. The stars were like gravel, and it was a vast expanse. Shenyuan Wuxiang's eyes completely turned cold. "Your Majesty, the god of war, you've gone too far. Let him speak." Qin Weibai said. "I still insist on my point of view." Shenyuan Wuxiang's words showed an extremely intense emotion. Right in front of Qin Weibai, he opened his palm. A glowing cube appeared in his hand. The cube slowly unfolded, revealing extremely small components one after another. One of the small gears, which was almost invisible, turned into a thick book. Shenyuan Wuxiang opened the book expressionlessly and directly turned to the last page. On the last page, the dialogue between the god of war and Qin Weibai had appeared line by line on the page. Shenyuan Wuxiang bit his finger and used his blood as ink. He quickly scratched out line after line of words on the page with his blood-stained finger. Almost instinctively, Qin Weibai sensed that something was wrong. She frowned and said, "Your..." Shenyuan Wuxiang's finger had crossed out the last line of the dialogue. Time flew. The white clouds were leisurely, and the sun was just right. Shenyuan Wuxiang's body trembled slightly. There was no injury on the surface, but the near-fatal injury began to gather and stack inside his body like a storm. His face instantly turned pale, and his breath completely fell to the bottom. Qin Weibai also had a real brand. He only crossed out a few lines on the page and slightly touched the real brand, but his body had accumulated unimaginably terrible injuries. He was the guide of Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai. He could use his authority to write in his book, but if he wanted to change it by force, he would have to pay a price. There was a moment of trance in Qin Weibai's eyes. This trance lasted less than half a second, and she was completely awake. Shenyuan Wuxiang quickly looked down at the page. On the page was the dialogue between him and Qin Weibai. "I just want to know who invited me to watch that movie." "Well, I didn't see him either." Shenyuan Wuxiang said with a wry smile, "How would I know if I didn't see him?" He picked up the Coke and took a sip. That man was wearing a black dragon robe. Puff! Cough, 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 cough. Shenyuan Wuxiang spat out the Coke and coughed violently. "Are you sure?" He looked at Qin Weibai and asked. "It should be the dragon robe. That dress is more fancy than Wu Qing's, and the pattern keeps changing," Qin Weibai said in a low voice. "World Punisher?" "No, it's all worlds," Shenyuan Wuxiang said softly. "What?" Qin Weibai asked. Nothing. Everything stopped there. Everything below was covered by the blood-like ink. Xianyuan Wushang narrowed his eyes slightly, and the book in his hand disappeared completely. Qin Weibai's voice sounded like the covered content of the book. Who is it? Tell me. Everything went back to before the god of war appeared. But the god of war was still there. This time, Xianyuan Wushang didn't hesitate. He coughed and responded quickly. He pointed to the god of war beside him and said with a smile, "Sister-in-law, are you talking about this one?" Qin Weibai suddenly looked back. The god of war stood aside and nodded to her. He seemed to want to say something, but Xianyuan Wushang didn't give him the chance to speak. He said with a smile, "Sister-in-law, let me introduce you. This is my third uncle." Qin Weibai, the god of war. Xianyuan Wushang looked at the god of war with a smile and called him third uncle. Qin Weibai frowned. She didn't know why, but she felt something was wrong with her current mood, but she couldn't tell what was wrong. She hesitated a little and said slowly, "Your third uncle looks younger than you." "Sister-in-law, it hurts my feelings." Fat people also have human rights. Xianyuan Wushang looked aggrieved and helpless. "Third uncle," the god of war repeated and looked at Xianyuan Wushang with a faint smile. Xianyuan Wushang's eyes were calm, as if it was a matter of course. The three supreme masters of the human clan, at least so far, were ranked like this. The great emperor and the god of war sounded majestic, but to put it bluntly, wasn't it Xianyuan the first, Wang the second, and Lin the third? She called the god of war third uncle, which made sense in terms of seniority. Qin Weibai shook her head subconsciously. She felt like she had overlooked something. It was like an occasional flash of inspiration, but before she could grasp it, the flickering thoughts had disappeared without a trace. She took a deep look at the third uncle in a black dragon robe, and for the first time, she used honorifics. The god of war was stunned and nodded. The atmosphere seemed to be a little too polite. Xianyuan Wushang scratched his head. Qin Weibai wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Finally, she began to speak. She and Li Tianlan were Xianyuan Wushang's brother and sister-in-law. So, she naturally had to call Xianyuan Wushang's third uncle. But before she opened her mouth, the god of war took the initiative to say, "Just call me third brother. My surname is Lin." "Well, third brother Lin." He seemed to find this title very interesting and he laughed. Qin Weibai gave him a baffled look and said slowly, "The movie just now was very exciting, as long as you're satisfied." "I'm also very satisfied." The god of war nodded. "Is it true?" Qin Weibai suddenly asked. The god of war glanced at her and nodded. "It happened after you left and came here. Dongqing's state was very bad. It could have been maintained, but after destroying Beihai, his state became worse and worse. In fact, he came here by accident and wanted to find you, but he didn't have time. It was because of that time and space intersection that the dragon vein in Tianlan and Dongqing's body could be complete. Of course, the man named Xianxia also made a lot of efforts. After Beihai was gone, you saw what Dongqing was like. So, I invited you to watch that movie, and at the same time, let Dongqing see you. His current state is barely stable, and with his current strength, he is qualified to touch some of the truth, so in the future, he will get better and better." "The truth?" Qin Weibai whispered to herself and asked, "What is it?" "Sister-in-law, I can't tell you now. It's very dangerous for you and him." Xianyuan Wushang interrupted. The god of war glanced at him and said calmly, "What I can tell you now is that you and Tianlan need to continue to break through. Some of the names here are interesting. Let's call it the transcendent realm in the spiritual field. But this realm is not complete, or in other words, there is no real limit. Spiritual power is also terrible, not inferior to martial arts at all. When your spiritual power catches up with that Saint Emperor and you can directly break out like Li Kuangtu, this fat man will tell you some truth. Spiritual power is a path, but whether it is Saint Emperor or Li Kuangtu, they only chose half of it. The right path is to combine the two. This fat man, me, and many people are waiting for you to go on the right path." Qin Weibai was in a daze, and no one knew if she heard the god of war's words. After a while, she asked, "Can Tianlan and I still see Dongqing?" When you know the truth, you will know whether you can see him or not. The god of war said softly, "You have been there, and he has been here. There is a chance." Qin Weibai nodded and didn't say anything. "What else do you want to ask?" The god of war looked at her calmly. Qin Weibai was at a loss. She thought she had a lot of questions. But maybe it was because her spiritual power had just broken through, or something else. Her thoughts were in a mess. In silence, she shook her head and said simply, "I haven't thought about it yet." "Don't worry." The god of war said quietly, "I will stay here for a while. You can find me at any time." Xianyuan Wushang raised his eyebrows and looked at the god of war nervously. Qin Weibai understood that he meant to send her away. She still felt something was wrong, but she didn't delay. She nodded and left. The clinic was quiet again. The god of war stood silently, watching Qin Weibai's back pass through the flowers and woods and step on the arch bridge. Suddenly, he said, "She seems to be in a daze. She knows something is wrong, but she doesn't know what is wrong at the moment. Are you sure it's good for her to be like this?" Xianyuan Wushang stood a little behind the god of war. He thought for a while and said calmly, "I don't know. But I'm sure it's not good to tell her part of the truth like your majesty did. I can help her withstand the suppression of the world's will and keep her safe." The god of war said calmly, "That's not something you should care about, your majesty." A sharp look flashed in Xianyuan Wushang's eyes. The return of these two is the most important thing in the space-time corridor right now. It's even more important than the current war. Your majesty, I have my own guiding plan and rhythm. Have you not considered my father's and the others' attitudes when you interfere so rashly? It's an accident. The god of war gave an explanation that wasn't really an explanation. What do you mean? Xianyuan Wushang was confused. Help me arrange for me to get to know Li Tianlun. The god of war's tone was simple, as if he was giving an order. Impossible. Xianyuan Wushang's response was resolute. He had been restraining his attitude, but now he couldn't bear it anymore. What on earth does your majesty want to do? Could it be that before his majesty returned, he also hoped that someone like you would come and disturb the process of his return? If there's an accident, there will come a day. Aren't you afraid of being punished? She won't remember. The god of war suddenly said. Xianyuan Wushang was stunned. Even if I just told her part of the truth, she won't remember. Once she leaves this door, she will forget most of the things and then remember them little by little. You know Qin Weibai's character better than I do. She's absolutely calm and rational. She's very receptive and decisive. There are some things she can't remember or understand. She will hypnotize herself to let go. That's why I'm relieved to tell her some things. You changed her memory, and I respect your choice. But in fact, it's not necessary. Even if you don't do it, she will forget a lot, and then the next day she will return to the state before today. Some of the things I tell her will only leave a very vague hint in her heart, which can help her correct her path. You tell her I mean no harm, but why don't you believe it yourself? Xianyuan Wushang was completely silent. He didn't believe that the god of war wanted to interrupt their return. But the god of war's appearance here really made him a little uneasy. There was a flash of hesitation in his eyes, and he asked, "Your Majesty, what on earth do you want to do here?" "To solve Li Dongqing's psychological problem." The god of war answered without hesitation, and now it seems that the effect is very good. This kind of thing can be done by Xianyuan Luanhui, and he does it very well. Why did your Majesty come in person? I felt the real imprint of Her Highness Qin Weibai. The god of war's eyes were sharp. From this point of view, you can say that Her Highness asked me to come here. Of course, coming here is also my original purpose. I don't understand. Xianyuan Wushang's voice was cold. What does my current state look like in your eyes? There was a very strange color in the god of war's eyes. Xianyuan Wushang turned his head and looked at the god of war in front of him seriously. The god of war's loose black dragon robe was still slightly shaking in the windless room, and the blood mist all over his body was like small fireworks. Of course, Xianyuan Wushang knew why. Because the god of war's real body was on the battlefield at this time. Only the end of the world could cause such terrible and dense injuries to him, a person at the peak of martial arts. In a real battlefield, This bloody mist might be the result of endless dark energy blasts, or gamma rays that exceeded the limits of the limit blasting his body. But why could he see it? Xianyuan Wushang frowned. The battle god in front of him should only be a projection of the sword qi of the battle god. The sword qi of the battle god had just swept past Miracle City not long ago, so it was completely understandable that it could form such a projection. However, if it was a projection, he shouldn't be able to see the injuries related to his real body. The current state of the battle god was indeed a bit strange. "You are?" Xianyuan Wushang asked softly. "This is me." The god of war said, "You can think of it as my real body, but this is an illusory real body." Xianyuan Wushang was dumbfounded. What was an illusory real body? Martial arts also had such fancy means now? "This is a new thing I've been studying." The god of war said, "I didn't mean to do this, but I didn't expect to come up with these messy things." A new thing. Xianyuan Wushang weighed the weight of this word, and his heart was already surging with stormy waves. He raised his head and stared at the god of war. "You've created a new authority?" What was authority? Authority was not just power. Instead, it was something that was built on fundamental cognition. Only when a living being was conscious could it have the most fundamental cognition. And all the authority was the authority of the world. Eating, breathing, walking, and even the length of life were all part of the authority. Could be knowledge, force, or something else. Survival was the most basic thing. In a person's life, every word, every action, and every look could be said to be a part of the authority. And this was the most basic part. The instinct of breathing and moving was the most basic authority given to life by the world. The authority that could go from the basic to the peak was the authority that everyone in the neutral camp was struggling to survive. For example, martial arts. There were all kinds of authority, but there were only a few that could go to the peak smoothly. In the current neutral camp, there were only 3 kinds of authority that could go to the peak. In the simplest words, they were martial arts, fraud, and calligrapher. The creator of all 3 kinds of authority was Huang Shi. That was Li Tianlan now. And the order camp had 3.5 authorities. As for the dark shadow, they only had 1 kind of authority. But under the rules of chaos, they could ignore the camp and use all the abilities of any camp and any authority. And now, the god of war had created a 4th kind of authority. For the whole starry sky, this was really a big deal. At least, it meant that there was one more possibility for the neutral camp to go to the peak. "I just have a general idea." The god of war shook his head. "It may not succeed. At present, this authority is only to improve some of my own shortcomings and strengthen my own strengths. Maybe the upper limit of this authority is only level 5 or level 6. Your father has tried this much more than I have. The ultimate authority of this authority is," Xianyuan Wushang asked carefully, his eyes full of awe. "Killing. Destruction." The god of war's voice was very calm. Xianyuan Wushang's heart skipped a beat. This kind of authority was already close to the existing 2 kinds of authority. "What I want is the purest killing and destruction. All kinds of methods are okay, as long as I can destroy everything in the shortest time in the most straightforward way. But I accidentally created this thing." A touch of embarrassment flashed in the god of war's eyes. He seemed to recall the time when he was trapped in the screen. "So, what is this thing?" Xianyuan Wushang asked carefully. The god of war was silent for a while and said slowly, "This is a memory. This so-called authority with killing and destruction as the main authority, the only function at present is to make myself disappear completely." Xianyuan Wushang was speechless. "Be more specific?" The god of war glanced at him. "Be more specific. When you can remember me, I exist. When you can't remember me, I don't exist." His sword energy swept over the sky of Miracle City not long ago. So, in the biological laboratory, Qin Weibai and Li Kuangtu mentioned the god of war when talking about Li Huo. So the god of war formed a simple projection with their memories. He invited them to watch a movie. When the movie ended, the projection of the god of war was trapped between 2 spaces. So Qin Weibai saw his figure on the monitor screen. As long as Qin Weibai continued to think, the god of war would soon appear on the screen. But Qin Wei, she decided not to think. She didn't want to think, so the projection of the god of war, trapped between two spaces, struggled for a long time before rushing out. But even if he rushed out, he could only be trapped in the biological laboratory. He could only use his real brand to stimulate Qin Weibai's real brand. So Qin Weibai came here and had a conversation with Xianyuan Wushang. Then Qin Weibai and Xianyuan Wushang's memory synchronized. In essence, the god of war, who was just a projection of a memory, could directly appear here. This ability, Xianyuan Wushang looked at the god of war silently. It's a bit nonsense. If this ability matures, there should be many more ways to use it. It will be very terrible. The god of war whispered. But it's the wrong way. Xianyuan Wushang sighed. If the new authority was purely to kill and destroy, then the ability in front of him obviously had nothing to do with the authority. This kind of ability was more like a concealment ability. It was very strange, very fancy. So, introduce me to Li Tianlan. The god of war said. You want to? Xianyuan Wushang narrowed his eyes. Talk about swordsmanship. The god of war smiled. By the way, we can discuss the new authority. He created a neutral camp. Maybe I can get some inspiration from him. Chapter 1288. She left the clinic. When she calmed down completely, it was already evening. The blood-red setting sun burned the layers of clouds, rendering the entire sky magnificent. Qin Weibai sat alone in the pavilion, looking at the sky in the distance. She watched the light between heaven and earth turn from daytime to dim yellow, to fiery red, to dark, and to dim little by little. The setting sun completely sank. There was only a dim yellow afterglow in the distant sky. The bright moon had risen above her head. In the hazy night, the wind was cold, and the place was quiet and peaceful. Qin Weibai stood up and gently took a breath. In the hazy darkness of the night, a shadow also stood up on the grass outside the pavilion. The golden retriever, which had lived here since Emperor Dong's palace was built, looked at Qin Weibai and trotted over. The bell on its neck made a crisp sound as it moved. Qin Weibai looked down at it quietly. It trotted to Qin Weibai, squatted down, and quieted down again. Hungry? Qin Weibai smiled and touched its head. The golden retriever didn't move. It just wagged its tail comfortably, as if it wasn't hungry. It had completely grown up. In terms of a dog's lifespan, it wasn't young, but it didn't look old at all. Its fur was soft and beautiful, and it was very energetic. The golden retriever was undoubtedly very smart. Although Qin Weibai and Li Tianlan didn't spend much time playing with it, every time it saw them in Emperor Dong's palace, it would take the initiative to stick to them. If it wasn't driven away, it would stay near them and play. Qin Weibai sat in the pavilion for half the afternoon. The golden retriever also stayed on the lawn outside the pavilion for half the afternoon. It occasionally rolled around and chased butterflies, but it never left the pavilion. Qin Weibai thought for a moment and squatted down in front of the golden retriever. The golden retriever tilted its head, and its bright eyes were also looking at her. Its body was very clean, with traces of a very gentle perfume smell. The golden retriever was a very intelligent dog. If it was domesticated, it would be as smart as a 6 or 7-year-old child, so it could eat by itself and find its own bathroom. After Xiao Mahai became the director of Emperor Dong's palace, he directly took the golden retriever to his villa. In the words of Director Xiao, they were all His Majesty's dogs, so they should live together. Therefore, the director of Emperor Dong's palace spent a lot of time raising pets after work. Even if he was so busy that he didn't have time to eat, he would not forget to send food to the golden retriever. The golden retriever had reached the pinnacle of his dog life during this period of time, even putting on perfume, according to the standard of food and accommodation of the core members of Emperor Dong's palace. Qin Weibai's fingers gently stroked the fine fur on the dog's head. She looked into its eyes and whispered, "Do you miss your real master?" The golden retriever whined, and its eyes were somewhat innocent. Qin Weibai squatted in front of it, lost in thought. Many people knew the origin of this golden retriever. Li Tianlan liked dogs, but he never had the temperament to raise pets by himself, and he didn't have the time. This golden retriever was given to him by Wang Yuetong, the little princess of the Wang family of Beihai, when Li Tianlan first entered the secular world. At that time, the golden retriever was very small, only a few months old. Now, it had already lived half of its life. If only she was here, Qin Weibai murmured to herself, and her eyes were a little aggrieved. She thought of this morning. She thought of the scene when Li Tianlan hugged her tightly. He said that he had been thinking about nonsense these days, and he felt that he was not himself. He said that he was unique. At that time, Qin Weibai had never been satisfied, but also lost. That was the feeling of being loved by the most powerful man in the world, being spoiled by him, and being loved by him. But Qin Weibai was very clear that that feeling was for herself, but also not for herself. It was a very contradictory thought. But Qin Weibai was very clear that the so-called herself was two individuals. Although they were actually one, in the eyes of others, after all, they were two individuals. She was Qin Weibai. She was the master of Samsara Palace. She had always insisted that she and herself were really the same person. Military counselor and Flaming Fire did not agree with this. But Saint and Horsewoman tacitly agreed with this. Qin Weibai had always felt that it didn't matter, because she thought that they were really the same person. Memory, thinking, language, perception, movement, body. Everything was completely synchronized. Who could say that they were not the same person? No matter who it was, Qin Weibai could not care less. But only Li Tianlan was different. Everything should not have gone wrong. The master of Samsara Palace would die in Snow Country. She would become the only Qin Weibai, replacing herself and accompanying Li Tianlan. She was her, unique, and Li Tianlan would never find out the truth. No, there was no truth. She was Qin Weibai. This was the truth. She did not have to pretend to be another person at all, because she was herself. This was also her original plan. But the master of Samsara Palace did not die, but was brought to the Lin clan, which made Qin Weibai not fully get into the state at the beginning. Then some details began to be more and more loopholes. Li Tianlan now did not expect that there would be two Qin Weibai. So for some details, he just thought that he was imagining things. After a few days of madness, he now doted on her even more. But once there was doubt, it was only a matter of time before it was exposed. Especially when Jiang Shangyu was not dead yet. If both Jiang Shangyu appeared in front of Li Tianlan, it was enough to make him realize something. Qin Weibai did not dare to imagine what Li Tianlan would do after knowing the so-called truth, nor did she know what he would become. But his performance had already explained a lot of things. It was just as he had said. He felt that she was not herself. This was a kind of unintentional denial, which also made Qin Weibai's inner uneasiness reach the peak. She did not know how long she could keep pretending, although she felt that she was not pretending at all. "Baby, what do you think we should do?" Qin Weibai touched the head of the golden retriever and asked in a low voice. The golden retriever blinked its eyes and stuck out its tongue to lick Qin Weibai's palm. If he finds out the truth, he will not be able to bear it. "If your real master is here, maybe he can continue to accompany her in my place," Qin Weibai murmured. The golden retriever lay down and rolled over, showing its belly to Qin Weibai. "In fact, no one is a substitute. Your original master is not, and neither am I." Qin Weibai reached out and scratched the belly of the golden retriever and laughed. "He fell in love with me at the beginning, so he can fall in love with me now, right?" She stood up and stamped her feet gently. The golden retriever got up and circled around Qin Weibai, as if it wanted to play. "I'm going to accompany him. I'll come to play with you another day." Qin Weibai patted the dog's head, turned around, walked out of the pavilion, and went to the castle. The golden retriever sat in the pavilion until Qin Weibai's figure disappeared. Then it wagged its tail and turned to run to Xiao Mahai's villa. After washing her hands and changing her clothes, Qin Weibai returned to Li Tianlan's office. A large number of materials were still piled up on the expensive desk in the office, but some of them were obviously sorted out. It seemed that Li Tianlan had finished reading and memorized them. When Qin Weibai pushed the door open and walked in, Li Tianlan was not behind the desk, but sitting in front of the sofa by the French window, reaching out to pinch between his eyebrows. Qin Weibai trotted to his back, held his head with her slightly cold fingertips, and let him lean on the sofa. She smiled softly and said, "Tired? I'm fine." Li Tianlan opened his eyes, moved his body, and tried to push his head up. Qin Weibai obediently bent down slightly, letting his head touch her chest. "Are you hungry? Should I order some food? Or should I make some dishes for you?" Qin Weibai looked down at Li Tianlan. Her cooking skills could be said to have been taught by Yu Donglai, because she was extremely confident. Li Tianlan looked up at her. He rarely looked at Qin Weibai from this angle. To be exact, it was the first time. The face in his sight was still beautiful, exquisite, and dreamy. Separated by the proud peaks, it was hazy, but it had a special charm. "Forget it, eat whatever you like. I'm mainly eating you tonight." Li Tianlan reached out and pinched her face. "You're not serious." Qin Weibai glared at him. "Then let's talk about something serious." Li Tianlan moved his body. "I just talked to Zhou Yu on the phone." Qin Weibai was stunned, and a touch of deep thought flashed in her eyes. "Zhou Yu of Huading?" Li Tianlan said yes. Qin Weibai subconsciously slowed down the strength of massaging Li Tianlan and pondered. In today's Zhongzhou state politics, when it came to the hot young people, the first was naturally the current governor of Nanyue, Zhou Yuanshan, who was almost certain to become the speaker of Nanyue after the election. At the age of 38, almost everyone thought that he would be the new leader of the new group in 15 to 20 years. The second was the governor of Jianghuai, Wang Jingxin. He was the core figure of the Wang family of Beihai and the Southeast Group. Although Zhou Yuanshan and the local forces of Xianxia worked together to push him out of Xianxia during the internal reshuffle of Beihai, Wang Jingxin did not show any signs of decline after he went to Jianghuai. In the past 2 years in Jianghuai, he was quite diligent. He was about the same age as Zhou Yuanshan. In this election, Zhou Yuanshan would enter the parliament one step ahead of him, but no one dared to say that Wang Jingxin would not have a chance in the future. In this position, there were too many variables between advance and retreat. A little carelessness could cause one to waste a few years in the same place. It was not uncommon for the latecomer to catch up. And after Wang Jingxin, it was the current deputy speaker of the Southwest Group, Zhou Qi. In the past year, Zhou Qi's status had soared like a rocket. Seriously speaking, Zhou Qi began to become more and more conspicuous when Qin Fangqing began to be unable to bear the pressure. After Qin Fangqing's death, Zhou Qi suddenly became the core of the core. Obviously, the Prince Group intended to unite all the forces that could be united. By supporting Zhou Qi, they could get the full support of the former forces of Zhou Tong and deal with the pressure from the new group and the Southeast Group more easily. Zhou Qi was now the deputy speaker of the Southwest Group. There were already rumors that after the election, he might skip the transition of the mayor and directly become the speaker. This year, Zhou Qi was in his early 40s. If he could reach the top in Southwest City, he would undoubtedly enter the parliament. This was also what the Prince Group was currently working hard to promote. After Zhou Qi was Zhou Yu. Although they had the same surname, they were not relatives. Zhou Yu was the nephew of Zhou Yunhai, the current leader of the North Group and the current mayor of Huading. He was also in his early 40s. He was originally only the deputy mayor of Northern City. The reason why he could control the Huading municipal government was that the Prince Group and the Academy worked together to suppress the Southeast Group and the Giant Group more than 2 years ago. The North Group repeatedly jumped around and gained a lot of benefits, a considerable part of which fell on Zhou Yu. When Yu Chuanguang left Huading and was transferred to Wuyue, Zhou Qi took one step from Northern City to Huading and held the position of mayor. According to the intelligence of the new group and the Southeast Group, Zhou Qi's current life in Huading was not good, but it was not bad either. He had established his authority and firmly grasped a series of matters in the municipal government, especially the financial power. This was also his most powerful weapon against the speaker of the Prince Group. As long as he could hold the financial power, it would be difficult for the speaker to intervene in the big matters of the municipal government. If the speaker wanted to intervene, he could only make a deal with him with the power of speech. Originally, it was not a bad situation to maintain this situation. After the election, the speaker of Huating would retire, Even if he could not take advantage of the situation to take the position, it was enough to further expand his influence by staying in the position of mayor for the future. But now Huading was turbulent and Zhou Yu was in it. His position suddenly became extremely critical. In the face of the increasingly strange situation, it was completely understandable that he had some ideas. Zhou Yu took the initiative to find you? Qin Weibai's voice was very gentle. Li Tianlan nodded and said, yes. He can't get the position of speaker. Qin Weibai's voice was crisp and decisive. What was Huading's status in Zhongzhou State? It was the most prosperous international metropolis in the whole of Zhongzhou State and one of the main windows of Zhongzhou State to the outside world. Those who could sit in the position of speaker were all big shots at the top level of governor, and then became one of the most influential members of parliament in Zhongzhou State. Zhou Yu's qualifications were far from enough. In fact, based on his qualifications, it was already the limit for him to sit in the position of mayor. Under normal circumstances, it was unlikely for him to sit in this position. He's still very clear-headed. Li Tianlan smiled. He doesn't plan to fight for the position of speaker, but he hopes to get my support to fight for a few heavyweight positions in Huading for him. The situation in Huading is quite serious this time, and it is estimated that there will be a complete reshuffle before the election. Is he going to be the uncrowned king in Huading? Qin Weibai smiled. Fighting for a few heavyweight positions, such as the Ministry of Personnel, the Supervisory Department, the Police. If these departments were controlled by Zhou Yu, he would promote a standing director from the municipal government. Together with the current speaker of Wudong New Area and the military representative who naturally stood with the Dongqing clan, Zhou Yu would occupy 7 positions in the director's seat in Huading. What did this mean? No matter whether there were 11 or 13 people in the Huading Council after the reshuffle, 7 votes was a majority. With these, even if Zhou Yu was not the speaker, many decisions in Huading could not be carried out without his approval. As an absolutely powerful second-in-command, as long as he knew his limits and could make the group and the parliament believe that he could control Huading, he would be the next speaker of Huading. The uncrowned king is exaggerating. Li Tianlan said softly, but he thinks he can be a powerful helmsman of the municipal government. It's not appropriate. Qin Weibai said softly. Li Tianlan was silent for a moment and nodded. Indeed, so, he reached out and patted the document beside him. I refuse. Qin Weibai bent down to take the document and glanced at it. It should be the information that Li Tianlan found temporarily. On it were the resumes and information of the current 13 directors of Huading, including various actual conditions, ages, origins, and important speeches on various occasions. Now there were 12 directors in Huading, and one of them was already drinking tea in the supervisory department. His information was not important. Qin Weibai quickly flipped through it and said softly, Huading, a place of trouble? Zhou Yu is a man with a heart. He wants to stay in Huading and fight for a channel of promotion for Xianxia in the future. Li Tianlan laughed. Zhou Yu was Zhou Yunhai's nephew, but now he was the core of the new group and his position was extremely firm. The relationship between the new group and the North group had always been very subtle. The two sides were very close, and in fact, they had a certain degree of in-depth cooperation, or even integration. However, Zhou Yunhai obviously did not want to integrate the entire North City into the new group, so he would support Li Tianlan on some matters. But his support was always limited. Strictly speaking, the two sides were not so much integrating, but it was more like Zhou Yunhai began to consciously eliminate those who were in the North group but had their hearts in the new group after discovering the strong influence of the Flourishing Age Fund. And Zhou Yu was a representative of such people. This was not a betrayal or anything else, but a very normal choice. The so-called group was just a force that everyone had to work together to fight against external forces when they had the same position. It was not impossible to change. Zhou Yu made a change, and the change was extremely firm, so he talked a lot with Li Tianlan on the phone, and the discussion was very thorough. However, Qin Weibai still shook her head. Tianlan, it's not worth the loss to support Zhou Yu now. I think if we can let Zhou Yu leave Huading, it will be the best choice. In recent years, the situation in Huading had been relatively complicated. All the major groups had their hands in it, forming a delicate balance. Now in Huading, Zhou Yu, the mayor, represented the power of the new group, and he was the only one. However, because Dongqing Qiuqi used to be the speaker of Wudong New Area, the current speaker of Wudong New Area and the representative of Huading's army headquarters were all members of the giant group. They were also Zhou Yu's greatest confidence and most loyal allies in Huading. Zhong Yue, the speaker of Huading, the ministers of the Ministry of Personnel and the Propaganda Department, plus the one who was now drinking tea in the Ministry of Supervision, were the Prince Group's base in Huading. The power of the Ministry of Supervision used to belong to the Southeast Group. With Wang Xiaoyao's betrayal, the Ministry of Supervision in Huading became Wang Xiaoyao's direct subordinates. They were not in the camp of the Southeast Group, but close to the Prince Group, but not the force of the Prince Group. The Huading Ministry of Supervision changed its commander a few days ago. The former Minister of Supervision was transferred to Wuyue, and Yu Chuanguang was also away for a while, so Wang Xiaoyao's force had officially left Huading. They still had some influence in Huading, but without a leader, such influence was destined to be useless. The new Minister of Supervision in Huading and the current Deputy Speaker of Huading were the force of the Southeast Group. In addition, a Deputy Mayor of the municipal government was the force of the North Group, slightly close to Zhou Yu, but not one of them. The other board members were from the academic faction. The Special Warfare Group still controlled the Special Operations Bureau. This was the current power distribution in Huading, and it was foreseeable that in the following period, this power distribution would definitely become unrecognizable. Huading had become the focus of the game between the Prince Group and the Southeast Group. The Prince Group had a strong influence, but the storm stirred up by Wang Xiaoyao was quite disadvantageous to Zhong Yue. This was also the weapon of the Southeast Group at this time. The Prince Group intended to win over Wang Qinglei and then get the whole Wuyue, but it did not intend to give up Huading. Seeing that it had lost Wuyue, the Southeast Group naturally wanted to use Huading to cut losses. The mentality of the two groups became the key to Wang Xiaoyao's survival in the crack, and the other directors who were still in Huading were just fish in the moat. With Zhou Yu's current position in Huading, he did see the opportunity, and even had a complete plan to take advantage of this opportunity. Qin Weibai did not deny that this could fight for the interests of the new group. But once he took action in Huading, he would directly confront and offend the Prince Group and the Southeast Group. This was not a confrontation of martial arts. In the game rules of the high level, there was no daring, only whether it was worth it or not. They could tolerate the existence of Zhou Yu, but they absolutely could not tolerate Li Tianlan placing a few more heavyweight directors in Huading. Moreover, Zhou Yu was not necessarily selfless. If Li Tianlan agreed to support his plan this time, it would definitely make the whole new group work to support him, which would also help him improve his position in the new group. Qin Weibai could understand this mentality, but the current Huading was really not so tempting for the new group. On the contrary, it was the best choice to let Zhou Yu quit Huading and give up the position of the helmsman of the municipal government. Quit, Li Tianlan whispered to himself. How to arrange it? Zhou Yu was the mayor of Huading. This position was extremely important in the governor's sequence, and it was also one of the positions closest to the councillors. From this point of view, this position was even more important than that of the speaker of some remote provinces. If Zhou Yu was asked to leave this position without making good arrangements, it would inevitably make people disappointed. Qin Weibai smiled and said softly, "At this time, as long as Zhou Yu is willing to quit, we don't need to worry about how to arrange it. The Prince Group and the Southeast Group will rush to arrange it for him. My suggestion is to let him enter Yuzhou, either the Development Committee or the Finance Department. The possibility of compromise between the Prince Group and the Southeast Group is very high. As long as Zhou Yu goes there, he can better cooperate with Wu Xiang and Speaker Bai. Zhou Yu himself will also be willing. Although such a transfer can't be called a promotion, it is in line with the strategic direction of the group. In the group, his position can also be regarded as rising. To say the least, even if he can't go to Zhongzhou State, it's not bad to go to Beijiang." Li Tianlan shook his head. "Beijiang? Zhou Yu doesn't have this qualification. Beijiang was located in the border, far less prosperous than Huading, but it was the largest province in Zhongzhou state, and the situation in some aspects was more sensitive. Zhou Yu was not qualified to compete for the speaker of Huading, nor was he qualified to control Beijiang. Jiang Shangyu would go to the front after the election, and the country of Beijiang must be retreated. This was also the bargaining chip that Li Huaqing gave to Li Tianlan. But who would go to Beijiang had always been a great headache for the new group. Zhou Yuanshan wanted to stay in Nanyue. The new group currently elected to replace Jiang Shan was the current deputy speaker of Xianxia, Ji Ankong. There was no doubt about Ji Ankong's ability, but his biggest problem was the same as Zhou Yu's, seniority. A senior deputy governor suddenly stepped into the position of a member of parliament, which was like a meteoric rise. As expected, the resistance was great. Even with the support of the academics, the possibility of success was not too high. At present, there was only one person in the new group who was qualified to control Beijiang, and that was Bai Qingqian. Li Huaqing also meant the same. Bai Qingqian went to Beijiang. Ji Ankong was transferred to Yuzhou as the helmsman of a certain department in the cabinet. He was Wu Jingmin's old subordinate and could better cooperate with Wu Jingmin. However, as soon as Bai Qingqian left, the new group would lose a deputy prime minister, which was greatly disadvantageous to their plan to win the right to speak in the cabinet. At present, this issue had not been discussed because of too much resistance from all sides. But as the election was getting closer and closer, this had become a problem that the new group could not avoid. Then let's not touch the speaker for the time being. Qin Weibai suddenly said. Li Tianlan was stunned. Zhou Yu and Ji Ankong both went there. Zhou Yu is the governor, and Ji Ankong continues to be the deputy speaker. Jiang Shan doesn't have to step down for the time being. We can arrange some heavyweight directors in Huading, but in Beijiang, it's not a big problem. Even if we don't have anyone sit in the position of speaker in Beijiang for the time being, the actual right to speak in Beijiang will be in our hands. Qin Weibai smiled. In this case, there's a lot of room for manipulation. Li Tianlan said softly, I'll discuss it with Minister Wu Xiang and the others another day. Qin Weibai said softly, Li Tianlan reached out and held Qin Weibai's palm, letting the slightly cold palm cover his eyes. He whispered, Where did you go? I was sitting here just now, and then I saw you sitting alone in the gazebo for a long time. I wandered around and got tired. I happened to see Bao Bao chasing butterflies there, so I took a rest for a while. Qin Weibai said softly. By the way, I also went to Fatty's clinic in the afternoon. Fatty's third uncle came. His name is Third Lin. He's very mysterious, but I don't think he's a simple man. Qin Weibai said in a low voice. Third Lin. Li Tianlan was a little stunned. What a strange name. And why was the surname of Fatty's third uncle Lin? I should meet him. Li Tianlan said softly. Xianyuan Wushang's background was definitely not simple. Anyone who knew a little about him knew this. His family, especially his elders, were naturally more important to Li Tianlan. Then call them now? How about treating them to dinner? Qin Weibai said, I'll make a few dishes myself. It'll be more formal. Li Tianlan thought for a moment, nodded, took out his mobile phone, and directly dialed Xianyuan Wushang's number. The phone kept ringing. Xianyuan Wushang didn't pick it up until it was about to automatically hang up. Just from his tone, it could be seen that the fatty was very excited. Big brother? Li Tianlan hummed. Before he could speak, Xianyuan Wushang had already started shouting, Go, go, go. They can't hold on anymore. Group 2, go and fight the boss. The others, follow me and guard the bodies. That priest, kill him for me. Li Tianlan was speechless. Qin Weibai subconsciously raised her hand and rubbed her forehead. Xianyuan Wushang, the internet addict and fat homebody, was real. Have you eaten? Li Tianlan took a deep breath and asked. I drank 2 liters of Coke. I'm not hungry for now. I'll order something to eat later. Big brother, what's the matter? Are you not feeling well? What's wrong with you? Xianyuan Wushang spoke very quickly. It was clear that he wanted to end the call as soon as possible. The corner of Li Tianlan's mouth twitched. He resisted the urge to rush over and slap the fatty. He said slowly, "You have a third uncle in Emperor Dong's palace?" Xianyuan Wushang was silent for a moment and laughed. "What a coincidence. He just left an hour ago. My third uncle was going to ask me to introduce you to each other, but I told him that big brother is a little busy these days. He said he understood and left. He hasn't been back to Zhongzhou State for many years and wants to travel around. Besides, he has a son in Nanlu State who also plans to visit his relatives. I guess when he comes back, big brother, you're almost done with your work. I'll introduce him to you then." Li Tianlan shook his head. "You don't have to be polite. You directly made the decision for me. We're family. There's no need to play these tricks. Besides, big brother, you're really busy these days. My third uncle wants to talk to you about something. It's not urgent, but he needs you to concentrate. It's meaningless if you can't calm down. So I asked him to come after the election. You should have some time then." Xianyuan Wushang said. Li Tianlan thought for a moment and said, "Let's talk about it then. Come over for some food? Your sister-in-law will cook for you." "I'm not going," Xianyuan Wushang answered without hesitation. "We're fighting a boss on the battlefield. Big brother, do you want to play games? I'll take you to Fly Panga Heaven and Earth. It's so fun. The company that developed this game is a subsidiary of the Flourishing Age Fund. If your brother wants to play, he won't need you to take him to play. He can shut down your account with a few words." Qin Weibai couldn't help laughing. With the style of the Flourishing Age Fund, Han Donglu naturally had a voice in the domestic game market. It just so happened that the game Xianyuan Wushang was playing was developed by a game company under the Flourishing Age Fund. It was bound to major domestic social terminal customer groups, and the situation was very popular. Xianyuan Wushang still wanted to say something, but Li Tianlan obviously didn't want to argue with him. He hung up impatiently and threw the phone aside. "It's quite interesting." Qin Weibai chuckled and said, "The fat man is obviously not a simple person, but he is willing to stay in the clinic all day, drinking Coke and playing games. I heard that he bought hundreds of cases of Coke some time ago and drank it like water every day. But he didn't get fat when I saw him today. Sooner or later, he will get diabetes. Bullshit, doctor." Li Tianlan shook his head. Qin Weibai said softly, "Let's have dinner by ourselves. What do you want to eat?" "No, let's rest." Li Tianlan stood up and stretched himself. He looked at Qin Weibai and smiled wantonly. Qin Weibai blushed and subconsciously wanted to run. But as soon as she turned around, Li Tianlan had directly appeared in front of her and held her in his arms. His sword energy permeated every corner of Emperor Dong's palace. Within the range of the sword energy, he could really move. No matter where Qin Weibai ran, she would directly run into his arms. "Can't wait?" Li Tianlan's voice was a little playful. Qin Weibai stared at him. Her eyes were charming without any lethality. Go to rest. Aren't you tired?" Qin Weibai stammered. "Do you remember what you promised me today?" Li Tianlan asked, narrowing his eyes. Qin Weibai bit her red lip and didn't speak. She would not be so reluctant, but when she thought of Li Tianlan's demands today, she felt so ashamed that she couldn't lift her head. "So naughty? You don't keep your word?" Li Tianlan's fingers gently rubbed her chin. "Stop it." Qin Weibai pushed him gently. Her pink earlobes turned red. "I'll just wear it. First, take a shower. Remember that red scarf? I like it very much." Qin Weibai rolled her eyes at him. The tenderness in her eyes was really amorous. Li Tianlan was hot-headed. He carried Qin Weibai in his arms and directly rushed to the bathroom. Half an hour later, he, who had taken advantage of her, was driven out by the goddess who couldn't bear it anymore. In a good mood, he played Qin Weibai's favorite music in the bedroom. He sprayed some perfume in the air and dimmed the lights. Qin Weibai used to do these things. Li Tianlan had seen it many times, so he was also very familiar with it. Qin Weibai continued to dawdle in the bathroom for half an hour. The bathroom door opened. Qin Weibai wrapped herself in a bath towel, walked out quietly, and slipped into the cloakroom. She should be looking for the scarf. Li Tianlan chuckled and took out a cigarette. After thinking for a while, he found a box of cigars from the bedside table, opened it, and lit it. The mellow smoke and the smell of perfume slowly mixed in the air. Nearly 20 minutes later, the cloakroom door was carefully opened. Qin Weibai's trembling voice sounded. Tianlan, Qin Weibai took a puff of the cigar, feeling a little comfortable. Turn off the light, okay? It's very dark. What are you afraid of? Come out and let me see. Li Tianlan sat on the bed and narrowed his eyes. If you don't come out, I'll go in and catch her. There was silence in the cloakroom. Li Tianlan could imagine the goddess standing at the door, hesitating and biting her red lips. Finally, the door of the cloakroom slowly closed. Qin Weibai walked into Li Tianlan's sight little by little. Li Tianlan's breath suddenly stopped, and he subconsciously took a big puff of the cigar. Come here. The smoke came out of his mouth little by little, and his voice trembled slightly. Qin Weibai was really well behaved. She carried out Li Tianlan's request perfectly. Black silk. But it was not the kind of stockings that were one piece, but two separate stockings. The silver stilettos studded with diamonds shone with an incomparably seductive luster in the dimly lit room, making her, who was already 1.76 meters tall, look even taller. It seemed that she could not find the red silk scarf. Qin Weibai wore a colorful, soft silk scarf around her slender and proud neck. There was a small silver bell at the front of the scarf, which was gently vibrating with her breathing, making a clear and melodious sound. Qin Weibai was wearing a white top hat and carrying a small handbag in her hand. She seemed a little nervous, but she was still proud and noble as she stood there. High heels, silk stockings, silk scarf, top hat, handbag, such a goddess was dignified and elegant as if she was going to a banquet. But there was no dress, not only no dress. But what? Was no wearing no? She walked over slowly, carrying the handbag, and the silver bell on the silk scarf gently rippled. Li Tianlan touched his nose subconsciously. Fortunately, there was no nosebleed. You're so bad. Qin Weibai walked to Li Tianlan's side, and her face was full of red clouds. Do you want to bully me in different ways every day? You don't like it? Li Tianlan asked. Qin Weibai's eyes were extremely soft, and her voice was sweet. Do you like it? I like it. Li Tianlan nodded seriously. It's very coquettish but also very cute. Qin Weibai bit her lip and stared at him weakly. Her delicate body was slightly trembling. Li Tianlan took a deep puff of the cigar and forced himself to calm down. He puffed the smoke on Qin Weibai's face, narrowed his eyes, and chuckled. Kneel down. Qin Weibai put her legs together and looked at Li Tianlan with hazy eyes. You don't look like you did when you said that you had low self-esteem and lied to me to sleep with you. In the smoke, Qin Weibai saw a pair of firm and fiery eyes. Li Tianlan's voice rang out. You're mine. Qin Weibai hummed in a low voice. Kneel down. Li Tianlan said. Qin Weibai sighed softly and slowly knelt down in front of Li Tianlan. Her movements were elegant and weak. She knelt on the carpet, straightened her upper body, and looked up at Li Tianlan. Her eyes were hazy and blurred. This was undoubtedly the most conquering gesture for men. In his sight was still that perfect and dreamy face. Her face was cold, delicate, and flushed red. She was charming and submissive. I hate it. Qin Weibai's voice was soft. It's so embarrassing. How dare you talk back? Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows. You're the one who wants to talk back. I didn't. Qin Weibai looked at him with some grievance. Li Tianlan chuckled. Qin Weibai lowered her head. In the room, soft music surrounded them, accompanied by the soft rhythmic sound of silk scarves and silver bells. Li Tianlan gently reached out, took off Qin Weibai's little hat, and stroked her hair, which was still a little wet. Little bai. His voice was very soft. Little baby? Li Tianlan lowered his head, and the smile in his eyes seemed to be overflowing. It's really strange. Can you tell me why you're not wearing clothes? Hiss. Li Tianlan suddenly took a deep breath. Qin Weibai gently bit him and raised her head. Her breathing was a little disordered, and her eyes were blurred and clear. She said with hatred, "I'll fight with you." The wind was blowing outside Emperor Dong's palace. That night, in Dong Huang's bedroom, the crisp silver bells rang until midnight. Chapter 1289. Late at night, in the headquarters of the Purgatory of Heaven capital, Li Kuangtu, who was sweating profusely, suddenly sat up on the large double bed in the bedroom. His face was deathly pale and his eyes were muddled. Cold sweat dripped down his face drop by drop. His breathing was extremely rapid, and he closed his eyes to feel his intense heartbeat. He slowly held his breath, and after a long while, he let out a long sigh. His movements were so violent that Phoenix, who had been taking care of her son and had just fallen asleep, also woke up. She moved her body gently, grabbed the clothes and put them on herself. She reached out and touched Li Kuangtu's face, saying softly, "Did you have a nightmare?" Li Kuangtu reluctantly said, "I dreamed." He suddenly frowned. In the dream, countless pictures began to fade at an unimaginable speed, blurred, and almost disappeared completely. But the palpitations that shook the soul still existed, and they became stronger and stronger. Through the illusory dream, they became clearer and clearer in reality. What did I dream about? Li Kuangtu frowned. He was now one of the grandmasters of Kendo in the dark world, but he was a grandmaster of Kendo in the spiritual field. His willpower was so strong that he shouldn't even dream, let alone have nightmares. It had never happened before that he didn't remember what happened after having a nightmare. What did this mean? Li Kuangtu tried to calm down, trying to grasp the last trace of the dream. Red dress. Snow White. Laughing stock. Li Kuangtu's heart suddenly flashed and he suddenly said, "Who is the sword god?" When he asked this, he was also stunned for a moment. This title suddenly emerged from his heart, without antecedents or consequences. It suddenly appeared in his mind, and then began to become more and more profound. What sword god? Phoenix looked at him blankly. Where is the sword god in the dark world now? Who dares to use this title? But I have heard a saying that if Wang Tianzong is the sword emperor of the dark world, then Lin Fengting can be called sword sage. I really don't know how arrogant the title of sword god can be. Even Li Tianlan doesn't have this title now. Li Kuangtu took a deep breath. The sword god definitely exists. I just saw him. No, I just dreamed of him. No, it's not a dream. No, it's a dream. In the extremely chaotic murmur, Li Kuangtu reached out and grabbed his scalp, pulling it hard. I must have forgotten something. So good. Li family. Phoenix gently leaned over and hugged Li Kuangtu tightly. Her voice was a little worried. You're tired. You've been under a lot of pressure recently. Relax and have a good rest. There's no sword god in the dark world. It's just a dream. Sleep for a while and you'll be fine after you wake up. Li Kuangtu quietly felt the warmth of the phoenix, motionless like a statue. His eyes, which had been a little hazy when he had just woken up, gradually became clear, as if he had returned to his most normal state. He reached out his hand and patted Phoenix's back. He said in a low voice, "I'm fine, but I'm more and more sure that I must have experienced something in Emperor Dong's palace, but I forgot about it." After a pause, he said softly, "It must be something very important." Hypnosis? Phoenix frowned. Li Kuangtu, who had just woken up from a nightmare, was indeed in a somewhat abnormal state of mind, as if he had been hypnotized but failed. Did Qin Weibai do it? Today. No, it was yesterday. No, recently, I haven't seen Qin Weibai. Li Kuangtu shook his head. I'm a little confused now. You sleep first. Let me be quiet for a while. Phoenix took a serious look at him and suppressed her inner worry. Suddenly, she chuckled. You must have been under too much pressure recently. Now that you've regained your freedom and your heart is relaxed, the accumulated pressure during this period will be released with the nightmare. With your current realm, even if you're injured now, how many people in the dark world can hypnotize you? Don't think too much. Well, if you can't sleep, look at your son. The little guy is getting bigger and bigger, and I can't sleep well every night. If you look after him, I can have a good rest. Li Kuangtu smiled, passed Phoenix, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at the crib in front of him. In the crib, the child, who was a few years old, closed his eyes and fell asleep, breathing evenly and gently. Li Kuangtu looked at his son silently. For no reason, he felt a sharp pain in his heart. It was like a needle suddenly appeared, piercing all the warmth, love, and expectation, and piercing into the deepest part of his heart. The pain was earth-shattering, and the warmth in his heart instantly turned cold and bloody. "No," Li Kuangtu said softly. Phoenix, who had just laid down, looked up at him. "I must have forgotten something," Li Kuangtu said softly, and his eyes became more and more sober. "There must be something very important. But I have forgotten about it. What could it be?" Phoenix was a little helpless. Li Kuangtu also wanted to say that it was nothing. He wanted to say that the Purgatory of Heaven Capital and Emperor Dong's palace had become enemies. In the enemy's territory, he couldn't get too much confidential information, so it wouldn't be a big deal, even if he ignored some things. But he couldn't convince himself at all. He couldn't remember the dream at all. But the feeling of palpitation, panic, anger, and humiliation began to grow stronger and stronger. All kinds of negative emotions constantly stimulated his spirit and his heart was extremely uneasy and confused. "I have to figure out what happened," Li Kuangtu thought silently and began to get dressed. "Where are you going?" Phoenix got up again and helped Li Kuangtu get dressed. "Go to sleep, don't worry about me." Li Kuangtu gently touched Phoenix's hair and didn't answer her question. He got dressed, looked at his son again, and then walked out of the bedroom. It was 3:30 at night. Li Kuangtu looked at his watch, sat on the sofa and smoked 2 cigarettes. Finally, he made up his mind and left his residence. He was going to find Li Huaqing. If he wanted to figure out what he had forgotten, Li Huaqing, who came here with him, was the only clue. Li Kuangtu wasn't sure if Li Huaqing knew something, but when he was in Emperor Dong's palace, Li Huaqing was his only choice. It was not a good idea to disturb people's dreams at this time, but Li Kuangtu didn't want to wait any longer. Li Huaqing lived in a 2-story building not far from Li Kuangtu's villa. The Purgatory of Heaven Capital didn't pay much attention to external things. When East Island rose again, Li Kuangtu built Wangtian Pavilion in Heaven Capital. From East Island to Tianan, the headquarters of the Purgatory of Heaven Capital was much more casual. Compared with the ambition of Emperor Dong's palace to swallow the whole Xianyuan city and even the whole Tianan, the headquarters of the Purgatory of Heaven Capital was a bit shabby. The whole headquarters cost no more than 100 million, and the living conditions were naturally incomparable with Emperor Dong's palace. However, unlike in Emperor Dong's palace, Li Huaqing was really staying here temporarily. The people of the Purgatory of Heaven Capital had now begun to pack up. Li Huaqing held a simple ceremony for Li Kuangtu here, and the formal ceremony would be held after returning to Yuzhou. Strictly speaking, the Purgatory of Heaven Capital had now become the Purgatory Army of Zhongzhou State. They would move before noon tomorrow. Whether the headquarters was shabby or not, it would only benefit Li Tianlan, so it didn't matter. Unexpectedly, the lights in the 2-story building where Li Huaqing was staying were still on. Li Kuangtu raised his eyebrows slightly, walked over and knocked on the door. The door opened quickly, and Li Huaqing's secretary, Ma Si, appeared in front of the door. She looked a little depressed. "General, what are you doing?" "The president hasn't rested yet?" Li Kuangtu asked. "He's on the phone with Huazi." Ma Si shook her head and sighed. She couldn't help but complain. During this period, the president rarely has time to rest. He is busy until midnight every day. Although the president is not in Yuzhou, he is very concerned about the situation in Yuzhou. Li Kuangtu smiled and said softly, "Indeed, he is such a person." Ma Si smiled bitterly and invited Li Kuangtu in. She made him a cup of tea and then walked into the study. Li Kuangtu sat silently, holding the teacup and waiting for Li Huaqing to end the call. Li Kuangtu could roughly guess the content of this call. It was said that in Huading, there had been a new breakthrough in the storm caused by Wang Xiaoyao, and the situation was getting more and more complicated. It had become a fierce battlefield between the Southeast and the Prince Group, and the academics obviously intended to profit from it. Li Kuangtu waited for nearly half an hour. The door of the study was opened from the inside, and Li Huaqing came out. He looked a little tired, but his eyes were still gentle and indifferent. He smiled and said, "What's the matter? Why are you in such a hurry?" "I'm here to ask the president to solve my doubts." Li Kuangtu put down the teacup and said slowly. Li Huaqing looked at him strangely. Ma Si came out of the kitchen and put a large fruit plate on the tea table. There were many kinds of fruits in the fruit plate. "Eat some fruit and tell me slowly." Li Huaqing smiled and said, "It's not bad to stay up late and eat more fruit. Not to mention me, you are not young. It's time to pay attention to health." Li Kuangtu picked up the fruit and put it in his mouth. He didn't know what he had eaten until he swallowed it. "President, today in Emperor Dong's palace?" Li Kuangtu frowned and seemed to be thinking about how to phrase it. "Did I do anything strange?" "What do you mean?" Li Huaqing frowned. "Anything." Li Kuangtu's tone was serious and serious. "Except that it was strange that you refused Tianlan's invitation, I didn't find anything else." Li Huaqing smiled and said, "Of course, I can understand your refusal. But in the eyes of others, including Tianlan, your refusal was indeed strange. Your refusal is indeed a little strange." "I don't mean that." Li Kuangtu shook his head and said, "I always feel that I forgot something very important in Emperor Dong's palace today." "You've already talked about this topic on the way here." Li Huaqing's voice was calm. "You said you forgot a dream. Maybe it's not a dream." Li Kuangtu was a little annoyed and barely controlled his tone. "But I don't know what it is. Maybe you just think too much." Li Huaqing ate the apple in his hand and chuckled. "It's the first time in your life that you've been captured, right? Especially when you fell into Tianlan's hands. Your mood during this time should be very complicated. When you're under great pressure, you'll definitely like to think nonsense. It didn't matter when you were in Emperor Dong's palace. Now that you've left that place, once you relax, it's theoretically possible to have some hallucinations. Today's negotiation was very clear from beginning to end. You refused Tianlan's request, but Tianlan didn't refuse the bargaining chip I gave. He became my student, you got freedom, and the Purgatory of Heaven capital became the Purgatory Army. What can you forget?" He glanced at Li Kuangtu and continued, "But there is something wrong with your current mentality. You should adjust it in time. Kuangtu, you're too afraid of Tianlan, so it's hard to put enough pressure on him. This is not what I want to see. I need him to grow under enough pressure." Li Kuangtu raised his head and took a deep look at Li Huaqing. His expression was a little cold. From beginning to end, Li Huaqing's attitude was very obvious. He rescued him from Emperor Dong's palace, but the president in front of him never intended to stand with the Purgatory of Heaven capital. They were not on the same side. To be more precise, the existence of him and the Purgatory of Heaven capital was just a tool for Li Huaqing to train his students. What would happen to a tool? When it had no value, it was naturally thrown away. Li Kuangtu smiled self-deprecatingly. He was sure that he had forgotten something which was likely to affect the future fate of his family and even the entire Purgatory of Heaven capital. But Li Huaqing couldn't empathize with his worries, and he didn't intend to. Because in his eyes, these people and these forces were just tools. To put it bluntly, Li Huaqing brought him out of Emperor Dong's palace to let Li Tianlan, who had matured, kill him. But Li Huaqing also gave the Purgatory of Heaven capital a chance to fight back. But Li Huaqing had always been on Li Tianlan's side. So his worries were a joke in Li Huaqing's eyes. Not to mention that Li Huaqing really didn't seem to know anything. Li Kuangtu could be sure that even if he really knew something, he would not tell him. It was undoubtedly a mistake for him to come here tonight. He nodded coldly and said indifferently, "I know what to do. There's still time. After returning to Yuzhou, you can also discuss with Jiang Shangyu and Gu Xingyun. Now the special warfare system of Zhongzhou state really needs some fresh blood." Li Huaqing said casually, glanced at Li Kuangtu, who was obviously absent-minded, and suddenly said, "You're really not in a good state now. Is it because when you saw Rushi today, she was not in a good state, and you were worried?" "What?" Li Kuangtu suddenly stood up. Li Huaqing's body state straightened a little for a moment. He narrowed his eyes, looked at Li Kuangtu, and said calmly, How is Rushi? Qin Weibai. Li Kuangtu's breathing suddenly became rapid. I went to the biological laboratory of Emperor Dong's palace today. Li Huaqing's expression was a little strange. Is this the thing you forgot? Li Kuangtu took a deep breath. He forgot that he went to the biological laboratory of Emperor Dong's palace today and saw his daughter. All the conversations between him and Qin Weibai began to become clear at the moment of recalling. But soon, Li Kuangtu frowned again. No, it's not just that. I think I saw someone there. Li Huaqing's expression did not change at all. He ate the fruit in his hand, picked up a tissue to wipe his hands, and then knocked on the table casually. The fingers fell on the table and made a slight sound. But this sound fell in Li Kuangtu's ears, and it seemed to be magnified countless times in an instant. Li Kuangtu turned his head subconsciously. In an instant, he saw Li Huaqing's eyes. Calm, indifferent, warm, yet incomparably deep eyes. Like an abyss. Boom! There seemed to be a huge roar in the void. The extremely fierce spiritual storm instantly enveloped Li Kuangtu. Chapter 1290. To be precise, it was a near-perfect ambush. In a situation where Li Kuangtu was completely unprepared and his inner emotions were constantly conflicted, at the most suitable time, an incomparably turbulent spiritual storm spread wildly with Li Hua as the center. All the items in the room shook at the same time. At this moment, Li Huaqing keenly grasped Li Kuangtu's thoughts. He didn't know what Li Kuangtu had forgotten, but with such a good opportunity in front of him, Li Huaqing didn't mind seeing it with his own eyes. Something was wrong with Li Kuangtu. From the moment he left Emperor Dong's palace, he felt something was wrong. In terms of spirit, Li Huaqing, who had hidden for many years, was closer to the transcendent realm than Li Kuangtu. He was even closer than Qin Weibai before yesterday. The spiritual realm was illusory, but it was also hard to predict. In many cases, the destructive power of this aspect was even more powerful than the destructive power of martial arts. It was also more bizarre and impossible to guard against. Therefore, the past presidents of Xianxia state, no, the leaders of countries all over the world, were naturally vigilant toward those who stood at the top of the spiritual field. The presidents of Xianxia state would also come into contact with some knowledge in this regard to prevent themselves from being hypnotized. In other words, even if they were hypnotized, they could still realize that their state was not right. Li Huaqing was even more outrageous. In the entire Xianxia state, except for Qin Weibai, no one knew that he was also a guru in the spiritual field, infinitely close to the transcendent realm. Li Huaqing pursued the middle way. Even in terms of personal cultivation, he did not choose a direction that was too extreme. In this state, he was not as good as Li Kuangtu in terms of the explosive power of his spirit. His real combat capability was probably only at the peak of the invincible realm. In terms of the subtle use of spiritual power, he was not as good as Qin Weibai. He chose the middle way, so he had the terrifying combat capability that Li Huaqing could have. He also had the unpredictable means that Qin Weibai had. The cultivation of the spiritual realm had always been a secret. It was not divided into schools, and it did not have the various characteristics of the 24 moves of sword or the 6 paths of reincarnation sword in martial arts. Therefore, there were very few people who could study it in depth. It was a complete coincidence that Li Huaqing could walk on this path. And it was precisely because of this coincidence that he was able to do things that even a transcendent realm expert couldn't do under certain circumstances. Li Kuangtu's figure was already frozen in place. Li Huaqing tapped his fingers on the table again. The moment the spiritual power that filled the room shook for the second time, Li Kuangtu's pupils began to enlarge. Li Huaqing's spiritual storm was synchronized with Li Kuangtu's consciousness, and his memory was instantly magnified. Under such circumstances, Li Kuangtu's memories and even his life were like a physical object. It was like a book or a computer. Li Huaqing's mental storm became a magnifying glass. The things in Li Kuangtu's memory began to be replayed under a magnifying glass, including the things he had forgotten and had almost no impression of. All of them began to expand and become clear. Li Guangtu's thoughts became something that could be touched directly. Li Huaqing entered Li Guangtu's consciousness. The pervasive darkness in the space of consciousness lasted for less than half a second. In an instant, broken, torn, Li Guangtu saw a violent and dazzling light. It was a sword light that pierced through heaven and earth. There seemed to be countless people talking in different languages, and it was hard to hear them clearly. It was as if there were countless people doing different things, and it was hard to see clearly. Only the sword light tore through heaven and earth, extremely dazzling. Li Huaqing's spirit instantly became dispirited, and his brain was in severe pain. Only he could see that the sword light was still shining, getting brighter and brighter. It was the endless fallen leaves and the boundless darkness. Light and darkness, reality and illusion were crazily intertwined in Li Guangtu's consciousness. The source of the sword energy was an extremely vague but extremely perfect figure. He stood under the heavy snow in the daytime, flicking up the fallen leaves. Half of the North Sea tore Mount Dibbing apart. He stood in the burning ruins, facing the majestic city wall. The eternal sword, the name of the sword was Donghuang. Dead silence, indifference, madness, and tyranny. That was the sword light that Li Huaqing had never seen with his own eyes. With the power to destroy everything, it merged darkness and light together. The city wall and Mount Dibbing were constantly intertwined in that picture, and finally all became nothingness. Li Huaqing suddenly let out a muffled groan. The sword light in the depths of his consciousness seemed to have cut off his spiritual power. The moment his spiritual power retreated from Li Guangtu's consciousness, he heard a familiar yet strange voice say a completely unfamiliar yet somewhat familiar name. Li Dongqing. Boom. All the spiritual power was instantly broken. Blood flowed from Li Huaqing's eyes, ears, and nostrils, and his body trembled violently. The surrounding space seemed to be constantly rotating, faster and faster. Li Huaqing reached out and pressed the table hard, resisting the feeling of fainting, and kept taking deep breaths. His brain became clearer than ever. That sword light, that city wall, that Mount Dibbing, these were the things that Li Guangtu forgot when he was in Emperor Dong's palace. But why did he forget these things when he was in Emperor Dong's palace? Mount Dibbing was in North Sea, and that city wall and ruins, if he remembered correctly, were probably similar to the East Island Imperial Palace that Li Huaqing saw when he visited East Island last year. That magnificent and unparalleled sword light was brilliant, turning the surroundings of the East Island Imperial Palace into ruins, and even completely tearing the entire palace apart. Li Huaqing had been the president for so many years, but he had never heard of such an awesome attack in East Island. If it didn't happen in reality, it naturally didn't exist. That was to say, Li Guangtu saw something that didn't exist in Emperor Dong's palace and forgot about it? Didn't exist. Li Huaqing suddenly stopped breathing. That sword light replayed crazily in his mind countless times. At this moment, Li Huaqing suddenly felt that the world around him was extremely cold. Didn't exist. Yes, the sword light he saw tearing the East Island Imperial Palace apart didn't exist. But a sword light connected the two pictures. He also saw that sword light tearing Mount Dibbing apart. And this thing, it existed, and it had already happened. That was when Li Tianlan was still in the desert prison. Mount Dibbing in Beihai province was attacked by a mysterious superior, and the opponent's sword directly tore Mount Dibbing apart. When some incomplete videos were sent to the Dark World, the whole Dark World was shocked and frightened. This sword move was not long from the Eternal Sword move. At that time, the Dark World generally thought that this sword move on Mount Dibbing already had the power of Mormon's Eternal Sword move. Everyone thought that the Dark World had already given birth to a new heavenly son after Li Tianlan and Wang Tianzong. But until now, the Dark World couldn't confirm the identity of the mysterious superior. The opponent suddenly appeared in Xianxia, and then suddenly disappeared in Beihai after a sword move, as if he had never existed. But there were still traces of them here. That was them. The private plane they took to Beihai. That Airbus could be said to be the most luxurious of the private planes. But after many forces investigated the Airbus company in France, they found that Airbus didn't have the factory number of that private plane at all. Similarly, the space agencies of various countries didn't have the registration number of this plane. This also meant Airbus had never produced this plane, and this plane had never been registered in the civil aviation system of various countries, nor had it obtained any license. At the same time, Beihai found a lot of terrifying weapon modification systems in that private plane. It was said that the design ideas of several of the weapons were at least 20 or 30 years ahead of the current weapons, and they were hidden by Beihai. Whether this statement was true or not, it was impossible to prove at present. At the same time, it could be confirmed that this plane suddenly appeared over Beihai province, and it was impossible to find out where it took off. All kinds of facts had an incomprehensible and mysterious flavor. This matter also shocked the scientific community all over the world. A large group of quantum mechanics bigwigs were studying the information of this incident and published one paper after another, thinking that this plane and the mysterious superior were a coincidence from a parallel world. The top physicists in the scientific community of Zhongzhou State were also among them, but these research papers were all sealed up in secret. But combined with this matter, the corners of Li Huaqing's mouth kept twitching. He quickly sorted out his understanding. First of all, in the depths of Li Guangtu's consciousness, the sword light that he saw tearing Mount Dibing was real from the current point of view. But the sword light that destroyed the East Island Imperial Palace was illusory. And this sword light, as well as a lot of pictures that flashed with the sword light, were things that Li Guangtu had forgotten. In other words, in the biological laboratory during the time he forgot in Emperor Dong's palace, Li Guangtu once again saw the sword light that tore Beihai apart. At the same time, he also saw a lot of things that had never happened, at least not here. No matter how he looked at it, Li Huaqing could see these in Emperor Dong's palace. At least it could prove that the mysterious superior who destroyed Mount Dibing with a sword had something to do with Emperor Dong's palace. His thoughts were flashing fast. Li Huaqing thought of the last voice he heard when he left Li Guangtu's consciousness. That name. That familiar but strange voice. It was the voice of Summer Solstice, the hostess of the Wang family of Beihai. Li Dongqing. He didn't know this name. But the familiar feeling was getting stronger and stronger. If the mysterious superior was called Li Dongqing and had something to do with Emperor Dong's palace, who would this person be based on his life experience? Who else could it be? Li Huaqing took a deep breath. In his mind, he thought of the research papers published by the top scientists. They wanted to prove the existence of parallel spaces through various explanations. Li Huaqing had read those papers before. He didn't understand them, but it didn't matter anymore. If his speculation was true, then it didn't matter what those explanations were. What mattered was that he saw the evidence deep in Li Guangtu's consciousness. The sword stroke in Mount Dibing was the evidence left here. As for the other scenes, it wasn't that they hadn't happened before. It was just that they hadn't happened in this space. Li Guangtu forgot a lot of things, but he still remembered this sword stroke. Because this sword stroke was real in this space, and it was an anchor point that could not be erased. Speaking of which, all of these speculations were actually self-justifying. Countless thoughts kept flashing in Li Huaqing's mind. He found that there was no shock in his heart, but a sense of relief. The world was big. He knew this as early as when he came into contact with spiritual cultivation. Li Huaqing opened his eyes reluctantly. In the bloody sight, he reached out and grabbed the tissue near the fruit plate, took out a piece, and slowly wiped the blood in his eyes, ears, nostrils, and mouth. An incomparably sharp gaze was locked onto him, not even blinking for a moment. Li Huaqing wiped his face and lightly said, "If you need an apology, I can tell you that I'm sorry." Li Guangtu's eyes were almost spewing fire. "What did you do to me? You said you forgot something. I just used a simpler way to help you recall it." Li Huaqing said, "You hypnotized me?" Li Guangtu's eyes were almost spewing fire. "You know hypnosis. You can hypnotize me?" "Transcendent realm?" "Almost." Li Huaqing smiled. "As I said, there is a big problem with your current state. If I want to hypnotize you now, I don't necessarily need the spiritual power of the transcendent realm. Of course, when you recover from your injury and adjust, I won't have a chance." Li Guangtu was silent for a while, and suddenly sneered. "I'm really a tiger that has fallen to the ground." Li Huaqing looked at him and didn't speak. His eyes were calm, but extremely deep. Li Guangtu's voice was getting lower and lower, and finally became silent. I'm not a dog. Li Huaqing's voice was very quiet. In front of me, you are not a tiger. Even in your heyday, you are not a tiger. Li Guangtu was silent for a long time, and then laughed at himself. Your Excellency, you really hit it well. The whole Zhongzhou state, no, the whole world is hidden by you. With your strength, you should be on the divine list. In any case, there should be a place for you in the top 3 of the divine list. It's a false reputation if I don't reach the top. Li Huaqing smiled very gently. And I'm the president of Zhongzhou state. What can I show off on the divine list? Li Guangtu looked at Li Huaqing silently. After a long time, he nodded and said sincerely, you taught me a lesson and I learned it. Li Huaqing didn't speak. He threw away the bloody tissue in his hand and continued to eat the fruit. There was deep exhaustion in his eyes. Forcibly reading or even magnifying a person's memory, especially for an expert like Li Guangtu, who was seriously injured but had surpassed the invincible realm, it was a kind of overload in itself. Li Huaqing's limit was to read his memory within 24 hours, and the time was only a few minutes at most. But the memory in Li Guangtu's consciousness was too exciting. That sword strike was unprecedentedly fierce. Li Huaqing saw many pictures in the sword light, but what he could really see clearly was only that sword strike. If his spiritual power could break through the transcendent realm, he might be able to completely see what Li Guangtu saw at that time. What did you see? Li Guangtu was silent for a long time, then he suppressed his inner anger and asked slowly. After deciding to leave the Heavenly South region and go to Yuzhou, the first thing he would do was to hide and stabilize his injuries. Li Huaqing, who was infinitely close to the transcendent realm, would be too dangerous if he was still in the same state. I saw a sword light and heard a name. Li Huaqing's voice was a little playful, with a little tentative tone that no one could hear. Li Guangtu froze for a moment. Do you know who the mysterious expert who tore Mount Dibing apart with one sword strike 2 years ago was? Li Huaqing asked. Li Guangtu wanted to say that he didn't know, but when the words came to his mouth, he suddenly became a little hesitant. He didn't know. However, he suddenly felt that it was inconceivable that he didn't know about this matter. What I saw was that sword light. Li Guangtu said, that should be the most impressive thing in your forgotten memory. That sword light not only tore Mount Dibing apart, but the sword light overlapped. In the overlapped picture, I saw that the sword light completely destroyed the imperial palace of East Island. There seemed to be a Mikado in a yellow robe standing in front of the imperial palace, but it was not the one I knew. Looking at the figure, it seemed to be a little like you, but it was not you. Li Guangtu continued to be silent, as if he had become a statue. I also heard a name. Li Huaqing continued to say, his name is Li Dongqing. Li Guangtu's heart shook wildly. He suddenly stood up and blurted out, Sword God Li Dongqing. Sword God Li Dongqing. Li Huaqing's pupils suddenly contracted, and he finally found out something. But after getting a vague result, Li Huaqing felt a little tired. Damn it, what kind of enmity does my name, Li Huaqing, have with your Li family? First, Li Huazhang, then Li Dongqing. Are you trying to blackmail me? He rubbed his eyebrows and said in a deep voice, Sword God? Explain. Li Guangtu opened his mouth and said, I forgot. He was completely silent. Sword God, Li Dongqing. This title, this name was so familiar that it seemed real. He did forget a lot of things. But just as Li Huaqing could think of many things through this name, Li Guangtu, who knew Li Tianlan's life experience, also understood what the name Li Dongqing meant. He could even think of more things. But when he thought of these things, the more he thought about it, the more uneasy he became, and an idea in his heart seemed to start to become clearer. That idea, that decision, seemed to have been decided before, but he forgot the decision. And at this time, the idea became obvious again. Li Guangtu stood up. He thought silently, and left silently without saying goodbye to Li Huaqing. Li Huaqing squinted at his back, thoughtfully, and didn't speak for a long time. Until another voice abruptly rang out. It's you. I didn't expect that the one who could get in touch with the fragment of order was the president of Xianxia state of this generation. They really don't give up. Li Huaqing suddenly woke up and looked up. In his sight, the god of war in a black dragon robe stood silently in front of him. Blood mist continued to spread across his body. Countless hideous and terrifying wounds appeared all over his body and healed over and over again. In the blood mist, the eyes of the god of war were a little fierce. In an instant, Li Huaqing only felt that the hair all over his body was standing on end. There seemed to be omnipresent sharpness everywhere around him. Wisps of sharpness existed in the most subtle places, and every wisp seemed to have a fatal threat to him. Who are you? Li Huaqing's attention was completely focused. The god of war wanted to speak, but then he looked around and didn't find the fat man. He seemed a little bored and didn't bother to introduce himself. He said directly, "What does order mean? Do you understand?" Li Huaqing hesitated and shook his head. "I feel that you are peeping into Li Guangtu's memory." The god of war narrowed his eyes. "This method is very unique. At least, Qin Weibai and that Saint Emperor can't do it. They can only vaguely feel it, but you seem to be looking directly. Spiritual power is one of the most terrifying powers, but there are many ways to use it. Currently, people here are just exploring, including that Saint Emperor and Qin Weibai. They are just exploring, just like a child who knows that 2 plus 2 equals 4, but doesn't know that 1 plus 3 equals 4. They also don't know that 2 times 2 equals 4. This is just something they have figured out on their own. It is very shallow, but it belongs to them." The god of war said faintly, "And your spiritual power seems to have received systematic training. Not only can you add, subtract, multiply and divide, you even know the equation. Your power is not something you fumble, but it is bestowed by the world." Li Huaqing stared at the god of war, not saying a word. "Let me change the question, one that Qin Weibai and Saint Emperor don't know. The beginning of spiritual power. What is it called?" the god of war asked. The corner of Li Huaqing's mouth moved. He wanted to say that he didn't know, but when the words came to his mouth, he chose to tell the truth. The beginning of spiritual power is the initiator. Then do you know what you are now? The god of war narrowed his eyes. Should be the consciousness statue? Li Huaqing said hesitantly. And then? The god of war continued to ask. Li Huaqing shook his head. "I don't know. That's all I know." "How do you know these things?" the god of war asked. Li Huaqing didn't answer. This involved the core secret of Xianxia state. He looked at the god of war and said calmly, "Who are you?" "Forget it." The god of war said faintly, "Your question is not important for now. According to the rules, you are the president of Xianxia state. At this point in time, I am here to say hello to you. I will give you a kind advice. You are a good president and have deep feelings for Xianxia state. But if you continue to break through in the spiritual field, the consequences will be unimaginable." "What do you mean?" Li Huaqing frowned. The god of war shook his head and didn't say much. Li Huaqing could directly get the fingerprint of the will of the world, and now he planned to make Li Tianlan his successor. From these actions, Li Huaqing himself didn't know that he might have become a pawn in the game between the neutral camp and the order camp. Letting Li Tianlan take over is the right thing to do. If there is still time, he should be able to stop some things. I hope you can move faster. You don't tell me your identity in the middle of the night, but tell me this directly. Are you going to tell me that my good student is destined by God? Li Huaqing didn't know whether to laugh or cry. There is no such thing as destiny. We shouldn't believe in the so-called mandate of heaven while we are alive. The war god said faintly, the so-called world, the so-called heaven's will, is most proficient in erasing the arrogance of the arrogant, destroying the arrogance of the arrogant, and destroying the arrogance of the traitors. As a human, the so-called fate should be in our own hands. You should do what you should do. Li Huaqing's eyes flickered. For example, the end is on, and the end of the world is coming. The god of war took a deep look at him. You're on your own. When you really make up your mind, maybe we can talk again. Chapter 1291. Li Huaqing didn't understand but felt it was awesome. The end had begun, the apocalypse was coming. Apocalypse? His voice was filled with absurdity. You mean the apocalypse? At this moment he didn't feel like the other party was a swindler. He just instinctively didn't believe it. It's the apocalypse of humanity. Don't think too highly of yourself. Even if humanity dies, the world is still the world. It's just that there will be fewer toys, but there will be new toys to replace them. You, me, and everyone else can survive. What does that have to do with the world? There won't be an apocalypse in the world, only humanity will. The corner of War God's mouth curled up. His smile was filled with mockery and coldness. Li Huaqing looked at his figure silently. The endless blood mist seemed to be his eternal background, constantly drifting around him. Through the blood mist, he seemed to see an incomparably great background. He narrowed his eyes and suddenly said, "Aren't you going to introduce yourself?" He used honorifics. War God Realm War God. The black dragon robe swayed lightly. Countless patterns changed crazily, finally turning into a flying dragon bearing its fangs and claws. Li Huaqing's spirit swept past the figure in front of him. His spirit power felt every detail. He could clearly feel that the dragon on the dragon robe was starting to crack. War God glanced at him and said quietly, "A very long time ago, even if this is a very long time ago, there was a very powerful creature in the Order camp. They were originally a part of the world and liked to live in groups. However, every single one of them, when they grew up, they would reach the pinnacle of strength. Some of them were very big and could even penetrate through the galaxy. Their bodies could change between real and illusory. When they were real, their bodies were almost indestructible. Each scale had the energy to crush stars. When they were illusory, they would turn into dark energy and dark matter, almost undetectable. They occupied the starry sky and viewed planets as dust. A lot of dust was on their bodies. Therefore, each and every one of them could be considered a small world. Countless planets, stars, and even galaxies were born and destroyed on their bodies. Li Huaqing's face was a little pale. They didn't need to do anything, nor did they need to maintain anything, because their existence itself was the order of the world. Do you know what pure order looks like? War God suddenly asked. Without waiting for Li Huaqing's reply, he continued, "Deathly stillness, dullness, everything is doomed, everything is unchanging, a pool of stagnant water." Later on, this creature discovered that some of the dust in its body produced a large amount of energy, and some gave birth to life. The War God went silent for a bit, then slowly spoke. For the world, living beings that naturally yearn for freedom is an accident in itself. From the world's point of view, these incomparably huge creatures have been contaminated by this life form. They've had enough of boredom and don't know the meaning of their existence. The more lives there are in the starry sky, the more excited their hearts are. Thus, they gradually began to form their own image. Horns like a deer, head like a camel, eyes like a rabbit, neck like a snake, belly like a crab, scales like a fish, claws like an eagle, palms like a tiger, ears like a cow. Thus the individual thought was born. They often turn their consciousness into infinitely smaller versions of themselves. Then, entering the dust on their body, these creatures began their first interaction with real life. That period of time was very interesting. Countless concepts of life began to constantly impact the thoughts of these creatures. Compared to their hundreds of millions of years of dullness, it was clear that living beings with the aura of freedom were the most attractive to them, but also the most rebellious. They gradually became attracted by the various characteristics of life. Of course, it could also be said to be tempting. They are the same as living beings, they can accept order, but they can't accept absolute order. They can accept chaos, but they can't accept chaos without order. After coming into contact with living beings, they gradually developed their own preferences and even formed their own order. From this perspective, as a part of the world's order, they betrayed the world. Silence. A long silence. Li Huaqing listened with great interest as if he was listening to a heavenly book. Seeing that the war god suddenly became silent, he was startled. And then, "I don't know." The war god went silent for a bit. During that period of time, everything was blank. The ending shouldn't be hard to imagine. The apocalypse descended, all life was wiped out, everything was in chaos. Li Huaqing's heart suddenly turned cold. The war god's voice was very calm, but as he spoke, Li Huaqing's heart was inexplicably enveloped by an abrupt sense of fear. Extinction of life. He muttered to himself. If there is extinction, there will be new life. Any civilization will go extinct, but life will never disappear. The war god said calmly, after the first extinction of life, the powerful creatures that betrayed the world returned to the world's order. The new life began to evolve from single cells. This time, the new life had more types, the evolution was wilder, and they worshipped freedom. This kind of freedom once again attracted the powerful creatures that had returned to the direct order, and the second betrayal appeared naturally. So the apocalypse descended again? Li Huaqing asked. Perhaps anyone who heard this story would think that the war god was talking nonsense. But Li Huaqing didn't. In his heart, he didn't have the concept of believing or not, he just seriously accepted this story. This time it was war. The war god laughed. The war between humans and the world. Li Huaqing didn't say anything. His eyes became extremely focused. Of course, what you said is also correct. The apocalypse did indeed descend, and the world once again wiped out all the living creatures at that time. But perhaps due to the war being too intense, or perhaps due to other reasons, this extinction was an accident. First of all, there were 2 living creatures that didn't die during the extinction and luckily survived. Secondly, the powerful creature that betrayed the world for the second time also survived. The war god became silent again. Another blank? Li Huaqing couldn't help but ask. The war god seemed to have smiled. In a trance, the great figure formed from countless blood mist seemed to have completely overlapped with him. That should be the first war against the world. I mean, it was the first time in my memory. There might have been many times before, but I don't know much about them. The first war against the world came to an end. There were very few living creatures left. With the help of that powerful creature, the last few living creatures made different choices. One chose to live as long as heaven and earth, using his own death to suspend the world's will. The other went to the end of the world and restarted the cycle of reincarnation. One used his own body as a tool to obliterate his own soul and gave his skin to his best friend. His friend used his skin to disguise himself. His friend used his skin to take the most powerful weapon against the world, luck. And the powerful creature that betrayed the world for the second time, when it was on the verge of extinction, entered his skin that contained luck and survived with great difficulty. The skin he left behind fused with luck and that powerful creature, forming the first divine artifact after the first war against the world. It was called the Infinite Worlds. He became the foundation. The last 2 have become our hope. After the cycle of reincarnation was restarted, they survived and relied on the existence of the infinite worlds to get through the most difficult period. They gave their kind of life a definition, or rather, a name. They felt that their kind of life should be called. The war god suddenly looked at Li Huaqing. Do you know what that name is? Li Huaqing shook his head blankly. Human. The war god gave his answer. They felt that their kind of life should be called human. That is the origin of the ancient human race. Meanwhile, the powerful creatures that fought alongside them completely broke away from the order of the world and began to live on the destiny of the human race. Thus, they became the first totems of the ancient human race. The first humans called them the dragon race. Humans and dragon race. Life and world. Li Huaqing, who had been listening with great interest, smiled. A new version of the myth? That's interesting. Then let's talk about something more interesting. The war god also smiled. The first 2 humans created the human race. Who are they? Li Huaqing's smile was obvious as he interrupted the war god. She. The war god was silent for a while and said, combining the known myths, Li Huaqing quickly locked onto a target. Fushi. It's she. The war god said lightly, this name is a single word. She and his sister Shibai. They were the first two ancient humans. It was also them who defined their life form as human. Later on, people used to call them Emperor Shi and Empress Shi. Li Huaqing shook his head seriously. Later on, people used to call them Fuxi and Yua. The war god had a feeling that this little brother was talking nonsense with him, so he simply ignored him and continued. In the eyes of the world, she is a warrior and Shi Bai is a thief. The former cut off a part of the world's ability to control the rules of the world. The latter, in a sense, stole a part of the world's imagination. Hence, they created the current human race. It is creation, a method that combines reproduction and imagination. Fighting against the world is the mission of the human race from then until now. Later on, Shi and Shi Bai still fell. However, before they fell, they created a force that could barely fight against the world. This power had an order similar to the rules of the world, but it was not an absolute order. It had a chaos similar to the rules of the world, but it was not an absolute chaos either. This power had found a balance between absolute order and chaos, so this power was called the neutral power by later generations. In fact, there are 3 paths. When you reach the peak of each path, you can barely fight against the evil of the world. This is what they left, and it has been passed down to this day. It is also the most precious treasure. With this force, more and more young talents appeared in the human race, such as Great Emperor Xianyuan, Emperor Yan, Xing Tian. Li Huaqing nodded cooperatively. The war god glanced at him and continued expressionlessly. When the later generations reach the true peak along these 3 paths, they will be qualified to represent the human race and bear the heavy responsibility of protecting the human race against the world. They are called human emperors. In the heyday of the human race, there were 5 human emperors, including Huang Shi. Do you know who the last human emperor was? The war god looked at Li Huaqing and asked, "You can combine it with the history you know." Li Huaqing narrowed his eyes. The title of human emperor was very old for Zhongzhou state. People were familiar with the title of emperor, or in other words, emperor. Who was the first emperor in the history of Zhongzhou state? The answer couldn't be more obvious. Emperor Zhou, who was known as a peerless emperor and had hundreds of sons. According to this logic, the last human emperor was King Zhou of Shang, who was famous in history for spending too much money but only had 2 sons. Shang dynasty and Zhou dynasty? Li Huaqing asked. The investiture of the gods that you know might not be fake. Of course, the 3 religions are more of a story. In fact, it was a war between the human race and the world order. It can also be regarded as a civil strife within the human race. We don't need to argue about the cause of that incident. But in that incident, too many experts of the human race were forcibly conferred as gods and returned to the order. The human race suffered heavy losses and its luck collapsed. The will of heaven and earth began to gradually gain the upper hand. It was from then on that there were no more human emperors in history, only emperors. But this is the place where the ancient human race rose. As long as there are people, the luck of the human race won't disappear completely. For thousands of years, the luck of the human race was entangled with the will of heaven and earth. Therefore, in the history of the dynasties during this period, the human race didn't really prosper for a long time. Shi and Shi Bai also died in that investiture of the gods. During this period, the will of heaven and earth and the luck of the human race kept entangling until the founding of Zhongzhou state. Until people began to return one after another, the will of heaven and earth that shrouded history was suppressed and the luck of the human race also began to return. What do you mean by return? Li Huaqing suddenly asked. War God glanced at him and said calmly, "Break the reincarnation and return to the starry sky." This sentence was extremely simple. But Li Huaqing's blood was boiling for no reason. 2 people returned this time, and they both left legends that lasted to this day in Zhongzhou state. One was called the Heavenly Sun, and the family he left behind is still strong. The other was called War God, and the family he left behind is also continuous. I know. Li Huaqing nodded. The ancestor of the Wang family of Beihai. The ancestor of the Lin clan in seclusion. War God laughed at himself and said, "Their return completely suppressed the will of heaven and earth here." but that heavenly son was not very lucky. Or rather, he was not as lucky as the ancestor of the Lin clan, because after he returned, he found himself. Found himself? Li Huaqing was a little confused. At this moment, he saw War God's eyes clearly. There was a meaningful smile in War God's eyes, and he said softly, he found the human skin that he left behind, which belonged to him. A feeling of numbness on his scalp instantly rushed into Li Huaqing's mind. His gaze subconsciously fell on the black robe of the god of war. The black dragon robe was awe-inspiring and majestic. On the dragon robe, countless dragons wandered slowly as if they were alive, piecing together into one pattern after another. Dragon, clan, all worlds. He found the human skin that belonged to him that he left behind. Li Huaqing held his breath subconsciously. The voice of War God continued, only when he found the skin could he be considered to be completely integrated with himself in mythology and history, and he could stand at the peak of a certain field. And standing at this peak, what do you think he would think? The current peak he is at, the path he is walking on, was founded by that best friend of his. 3 paths, 3 beginnings, all of this is just the beginning. So after he completely found himself, he wore the human skin left by his former self and returned to the place where he first returned as a consciousness formed by a wisp of memory, intending to find the 4th path for the human clan. By the way, he also came to see his former best friend, who is still returning. Then, War God laughed, then he saw the president of Xianxia state of this generation, and accidentally found that he had awakened the power of order. He felt it necessary to say hello to the president, so he came and told him a story. Li Huaqing's hair all stood on end. He stared at War God in front of him, opened his eyes to the widest, and said word by word, "You are Lin Xianyuan?" War God's realm, War God Lin Xianyuan. War God nodded. Thunder roared. Li Huaqing stood up abruptly and sat back on the chair weakly. War God's realm, Lin clan. War God's realm, Li Huaqing kept muttering to himself and finally smiled bitterly. If what you said is true, then your War God's realm is definitely not on Earth, right? In the starry sky. War God nodded. You are the president of Xianxia state. You can't be unfamiliar with extraterrestrial civilization. Isn't that what Bureau 719 of Xianxia state does? Bureau 719 of Xianxia state. This was a department that most people had never heard of. There was no official information about it, and its functions were absolutely vague. It was independent of any system and only answered to the president. This was a top-secret department that specialized in studying all kinds of supernatural phenomena and unsolved mysteries. Extraterrestrial civilization, extraterrestrial life, UFOs. These were things that ordinary people were familiar with but skeptical about. There was corresponding information in Bureau 719 of Xianxia state. Xianxia state, Star State, and all the major powers in the world had even received signals from the starry sky. For them, the so-called extraterrestrial civilization was really not a secret. Li Huaqing was not surprised that there was a starry sky life. He was surprised that the big boss of the starry sky in front of him turned out to be an acquaintance from Xianxia state. This feeling was really refreshing, and it also had a really nice feeling. Do your current abilities have anything to do with Bureau 719? War God suddenly asked. Li Huaqing hesitated for a moment before slowly nodding his head. He sighed softly. It's my classmate. He used to be the deputy director of Bureau 719. When I was the deputy speaker of Liaodong once found a very special meteorite with some symbols carved on it. My classmate deciphered some of the information and leaked it to me. It was some way of using spiritual power. However, what those symbols express seemed to be not realms, but power? Authority. War God gave the most accurate way to interpret it. The corner of Li Huaqing's mouth moved, but he remained silent. Your classmate should be dead, right? War God asked. Missing. Li Huaqing sighed. The day after he told me these things, he disappeared. It was a critical period for me. I was afraid that it would involve me, so I didn't dare to say it. War God sneered. Bullsh asterisk T. He's a puppet of the will of heaven and earth. He deliberately leaked this information to you in order to guide you to this path. After you break through again, you, the president, will become the spokesperson of the will of the world. At that time, with you in this position, the will of the world will once again overwhelm the luck of the human race. Zhongzhou state won't last long, and the end of the world will come early. Li Huaqing's body shook violently, and he suddenly looked up. Impossible. He thought about it, shook his head and said, "At that time, I was just the deputy speaker of Liaodong. How could it be? What's impossible?" War God narrowed his eyes slightly and whispered, "Have you ever felt that you worked very hard to do something, but when you were one step away from success, you failed? You felt that you didn't work hard enough, so you worked harder again and tried your best to do it. But when you were one step away from success, you failed for various reasons. Sometimes, there are some things that you are not interested in, but these things try their best to get close to you. There are many things that seem to be coincidences, but they are all things that people have to experience in their life. Different experiences, different endings, different consequences. If you do it again, it will be the same. If you do it again and again, it will be the same. It's like a dead knot that can't be untied and escaped." War God's voice slightly lowered. "This is destiny. Everything, your life, what you do, what you get, what you lose, where you are, what you say, what you do. Haha, in fact, all of this has nothing to do with you at all. This was because everything had already been predestined. It was like a well-designed program. It looked very lively, but in essence, it was absolutely rigid. Everything about you was predestined. From birth to death, there will be no accidents, no coincidences. From the beginning to the end, you are under the control of the will of the world, like a puppet. This is destiny, such a fate. Are you willing to accept it?" Li Huaqing's chest slightly rose and fell. "This is the meaning of the human clan's resistance." War God said calmly, "Fate, life and death, these should be in your own hands. From the moment you accepted the spiritual authority, you already had half a foot in the order realm. Everything about you is destined to be good." "I don't believe it." Li Huaqing shook his head. "I don't believe in predestination. I don't believe that my life has nothing to do with me. That's the truth. In fact, even in the real environment, if you have half a foot into the order, there is almost no possibility of struggling. But you met Li Tianlan. That's why I said that you made the right choice to choose Li Tianlan as your successor. Because in the real environment, his real brand can completely suppress the erosion of the order and the will of the world and break this so-called predestination." "Real environment?" Li Huaqing asked. "Real brand?" Li Huaqing continued to ask. War God still nodded. Li Huaqing took a deep breath, looked at War God and said softly, "What is this? Don't you want to explain?" You're tuning in to the Wandering Hero YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.